Hello, everybody. Welcome back to JamFest 7 Top 16. My name is Boulevard. With me again is the Wandering Bard. We're going to be getting these started off with some awesome action here for the Top 16 on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. I think it's Sunday night for you, maybe even Monday morning.
Monday morning at 4 in the AM, right here in Melbourne, Australia.
All right, so we're going to get you guys started with Blue Flower Dragon versus Topher. Blue Flower Dragon was a player that we saw sort of on the other end of the table a couple of times yesterday, picking up wins against some of our other top 16 players, knocking some of our favorites out of contention. And Topher, we had just barely missed on stream yesterday. He does have that super interesting War Mother's control deck that I really was interested to kind of get into on a cast.
Yeah, exactly. This is a really good example of how the meta, especially at the top 16 level, kind of deviated from, I guess, what we would have predicted the majority would be going into the tournament. There's been a lot of deck diversity, a lot of lineup diversity, even going away from that core lineup we expected in a two-deck format of, Shadow Isles, Freljord paired with Ionia Piltover. And especially among our 6-1s, even there is a lot of people either playing pet decks or something designed to try and hunt the meta down. Both of these players packing a little something special.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty curious to see how it works out for... Did I read this wrong? Oh no, I was looking at a different lineup a little bit before because one player had brought Twisted Fate Ezreal, but he didn't actually bring Ionia, but that's not the case here. This is going to be Ezreal Karma and Ashe Sejuani versus Ezreal Karma and the War Mother's control deck. So a little bit of a potential for a mirror match to come out here in the Karma Ezreal. I'm not seeing any major deviations in these lists that's making me think that one player is going to be favored over the other. Perhaps the Yone Windchaser coming out of Topher's lineup is going to make a difference, but we'll have to actually, find that out in the game.
Yeah, apart from the deck diversity, there were a lot of people trying to flex slots in the different decks, and it made the mirrors kind of interesting. But I think the Ezreal Karma list maybe was the most static of all, even more so than the Weimerdinger list, which we kind of had our eyes on for that. Very few people going far away from the stock plan with those kinds, mostly just tweaking numbers. Do you play 1 or 2 health potions? Do you play 1 or 2 denies? That sort of thing. And the Yone Windchaser probably the most notable card out. Topher going for that, but that choice kind of pales in terms of bravery compared to the choice to bring War Mother's control. This is not the Shadow Isles Freljord control deck that we were looking at all day.
Yeah, and it looks like we are actually getting into game here. And the one thing that's really interesting to me is that even the more unit-heavy War Mother's control decks will sometimes only run 2 copies of War Mother's Call, but Topher has gone for the full suite of 3 of these with only, I think it was something around less than 10 followers across the entire deck. Maybe it was 11. It's those Anivias, those Soul Gorgers, Tryndamere, and Ledros. Yeah, I think that comes out to 10 exactly. So a quarter of the deck is units, all of them extremely expensive, but that newly buffed Anivia, the mana cost probably not going to play out too much for Topher here, as he is looking to just hard accelerate into this War Mother's Call. And we actually see him bring out the Box and Avalanche as 3-ofs. That was kind of the card that was hotly debated among the Anivia players yesterday on which one was better.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting, right? Because a lot of people obviously went with this Bald Eagle deck, the Braum Anivia, kind of Anivia Reanimator plan. But it looks like Topher's deck, I don't know whether it's that he prefers War Mother's Call as a win condition, or whether he just wanted to waste less slots on kind of cards that are furthering his own strategy and just play a hard control deck. Because much more so than anyone else we saw yesterday, this looks tweaked for an aggro-heavy meta with playing both Avalanche and the Box.
Yeah, this seems like the sort of the Freljord version of the Karina Varaza deck, where typically, you run a lot of Shadow Isle removal and then you just splash in your win condition. Generally, the Karina deck has a lot more removal, but with Avalanche kind of being what it is, with Anivia being what it is now, you do have a lot of tools that the Karina Varaza deck has available, and we've even seen those decks move away from the Karina themselves. So pairing it into another region and giving you that War Mother's Call win condition, basically as long as you've got Ledros in your deck and a lot of removal, you've got something close to a tier 1 deck bare minimum.
Yeah, this is not a War Mother's Call deck like the ones that play, Avarice and Hearthguard or whatever, that are just looking to kind of outvalue your opponent. This is sort of a combo finish almost. I don't think there's any necessary specific interaction. Obviously, Atrocity and Ledros is a classic, but it's more just like once you get a couple of these units, the average power level is so high that it'll really only take a couple of turns of War Mothers to really put the screws on whatever you're playing against. So it's all about the removal. 3 copies of Ruination, 3 copies of Avalanche, 3 copies of the Box. Not only good against aggro, but also, as we saw yesterday, sometimes it takes multiple AoE spells to actually clear away the Bald Eagle boards when they're playing multiple Anivias at a time.
And so far, Topher has done a great job at stabilizing the life total. This tempo deck out of Blue Flower Dragon, this Frostbite control, has done a really poor job of putting on the pressure so far. It looked like kind of a weak opener, no 4-drops coming down, no Avaros and Trappers coming down. We don't see any real sticky unit until this Babbling Beard on 4, and it looks like now we're setting up for a Withering Wail that this Avaros and Sentry normally would play into, but it's been buffed up by the Omen Hawk, and Topher is going to, with this Soul Gorger coming down, I don't think he's going to feel any kind of threatened going into sort of the later stage turns when he can get this War Mother's Call down. I'd actually be a little surprised to see him attack here. Not super surprised, Blue Flower Dragon pretty likely to throw out the block with the Sentry at that point, but I would think that he wants to just defensively preserve as much health on this unit as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with multiple copies of the box in hand, you're concerned with how you trade with these units that are already in play. You just want to try and last the next few turns while stocking spell mana if at all possible, so that you have, either the panic button of the Ruination or, of course, the War Mother's Call, which obviously Topher is not necessarily in a huge hurry. He's not going to, concede his strong defensive position to try and accelerate that a turn sooner with only so few hits in the deck, and each hit being so powerful. It's more of a whenever it's safe to do so win con, but there's not a reason necessarily to wait if you think that you can pull it off. And that first hit is going to be massive, especially if it's, a Tryndamere.
Yeah, and this is actually a terrible position for Blue Flower Dragon. This is a deck that really needs to get out big boards into Trifarian Assessor in order to maintain its card advantage in hand. And now we are on the Ruination turn for Topher, who is still at 17 life. And Blue Flower Dragon, that could be why they haven't committed a whole lot to the board just yet. But I don't think this is necessarily going to play out in their favor in the long game. And they haven't, it's kind of this awkward position where you don't win the long game, but you also know that their hand is just full of removal that's going to take you out in the mid game. And maybe Blue Flower Dragon just has too expensive of a hand, hasn't been able to throw these things out. We do know that he has some 5-attack unit that he got off of this Beard, but outside of that, there are a couple of dead spells in this matchup. There's a lot of Frostbite effects coming out of Blue Flower Dragon and some Reckonings that are going to get absolutely nothing done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you characterized it yesterday, the couple of times that we did check in on Blue Flower Dragon, that this deck is sort of somewhat out of place in the current meta. Obviously, Topher's deck is not one that we're expecting to see either, but it seems more like a tech choice for things that people actually are playing, like these very heavy aggro lists. A lot of them ended up in the 6-1 part of the bracket, so you can see why you might want to play this overload of heavy removal, whereas this Frostbite control deck is much more about controlling the board, and very few decks that we saw doing well yesterday care about that.
Yeah, I think it might just be maybe a prediction on an overabundance of scouts. We had mentioned that the aggro lineups could be coming out to pick on the Karma Ezreal and the Heimer Vi, and this deck from Blue Flower Dragon should pair into those pretty well. But since he brought Karma Ezreal as his other deck, if that is something players are looking to pick on, they can just 2-0 that Karma Ezreal. Maybe just felt like he needed to give himself as much of an edge as he could in the other matchups, or maybe he just really likes this deck, thinks it's a really strong contender for the meta. And so far, it's gotten him this far. I'm not sure it's going to take him a whole lot farther, but a top 16 isn't nothing.
No, not at all. And it's very interesting to say that obviously these players are both at 5-2 after the first day. They, obviously managed to sneak through into the top 16 one way or the other. But one of the losses that Blue Flower Dragon took was to one of the 2 Scouts players. As 2 Scouts players in the top 16 both made top 4 at 6-1. Playing double aggro Scouts alongside Harrowing Darius. And as you can guess, it looks like Blue Flower Dragon maybe gave that one up 2-1. So just what you were talking about there before, where it's like, if you bring one counter aggro list, but another list that's softer aggro in this format, you're not necessarily setting yourself up as well as you might think.
Yeah, and Topher looking like he's kind of agonizing over how he wants to actually remove the Sejuani. It will be the second box fired off, which seems a little bit weird. The box is one of your more powerful board wipe tools, so to be able to, just playing 2 of them to kill 1 unit seems a little bit weird. It is obviously like a disadvantage for you to use that much removal on 1 unit, but with the board this small for Blue Flower Dragon, Topher's not going to have any problem just banking a couple of spell mana this turn, firing off that War Mothers on the following turn, and I don't know if he's ever going to fire off both of them. I don't really see a reason why he wouldn't. Getting out 2 units a turn does seem to behoove him, especially since the units that he's getting out are going to do such a good job of ending the game quickly, but perhaps he doesn't want to flood the board too quickly with 2 units and then have them start coming off the top of his deck and just immediately dying.
Yeah, it does seem like either you're trying to avoid, collateral damage on your own units later on, since you are getting to the phase of the game where you're very comfortable at 20 life, you've got a handful, you're looking to cast these War Mothers soon, or perhaps just trying to conserve the amount of healing that's available if maybe he's in a more pessimistic mindset, with this Soul Gorger in play. The other option to remove the Sejuani the Grasp of the Undying might have been a bit of a waste to pop that healing. So holding onto that in favor of using the AoE spell, since this Frostbite control deck is not really committing to the board too hard and doesn't really flood it out even at its best times, right? Like, this is not a deck full of 1 and 2 cost units.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're in kind of an awkward situation for Blue Flower Dragon. He knows that Topher wants to bank the spell mana this turn, knows that turn 9 is the turn where the War Mother's Call can come out, and now Blue Flower Dragon could try and flood the board as much as possible to entice Topher to play something that doesn't let the War Mother's Call come out. But of course, that does just set you up to get Ruinationed and then War Mother's Called on the following turn. So it's really a rough situation for Blue Flower Dragon to be in, who, in my opinion, kind of mismanages the attacks here. This is going to put Topher at 18 life. Actually, we do see the Brittle Steel come out, so doesn't matter. Finally finding some value for that card, which is going to take Ash up to 1 out, or I believe 2 out of 5 as Sejuani did get a Frostbite earlier, but that is not enough pressure to stop the War Mother's Call.
Yeah, and even then, those heroes, like, not only are hard to level up, but don't bring the usual utility in this matchup. So just a lot of the power of Blue Flower Dragon's deck not lining up very well against this War Mother's control that Topher has brought. That first War Mother's hit, not the most impressive thing you could have found out of the deck, but now that that effect is up and running, like, we've been talking about how things are bad for Blue Flower Dragon, they're only getting worse. Ooh.
Yeah, and there is a consideration to, maybe I can kill every unit that comes off the top of the deck as it comes off the deck. The problem is that Soulgorger is the only one that permanently dies. Tryndamere will flip over to his backside, Anivia will turn into Agnivia, and eventually turn back into an Anivia. And of course, Commander Ledros will just go back to his hand, so that Soulgorger off the top was really the only unit that Blue Flower Dragon can kill straight away. And now we do have Anivia out, who's going to be able to start sort of picking apart the board of Blue Flower Dragon. And Topher, understanding that in this position, the onus of burden is on Blue Flower Dragon to build up more of a board. He doesn't have to attack, let these things get softened up, and then, oh, actually, we see a Trifarian Assessor. That's sort of the punish, but it's not like Topher was going to remove that Hearthguard pre-combat.
No, and it's not even the largest Trifarian Assessor we've seen this tournament, so Blue Flower Dragon really just taking the best lines available. Obviously, the matchup seems tough, and especially at this point in things, but, Topher is sitting very comfortably now, and that's the reason why there's such a low number of hits for War Mothers in this deck, right? We've talked about how the Braum Swain deck, which might be the deck of the tournament if there is one breaking out, has preyed on this meta, or parts of it, by having a lot of very hard-to-kill units, and by making sure all of your War Mother's Call hits are as sticky as possible. You're kind of playing a similar game to what the best decks around are doing right now.
Yeah, and it looks like Topher is hovering that second War Mother's, perhaps not really caring about getting 2 units per turn, understands that he'll be able to end the game pretty quickly. Of course, does also have the option to sort of like Ruination his own board and get a reset on a couple of his champions, get the Ledrosses in his hand, and, just sort of set up more board space for himself to let this War Mother's train continue. But as soon as this Ledros dies, he's in a phenomenal position. He does have the Atrocity already in hand, and I do not think Topher can possibly lose from a position like this.
No, seems unconcerned, tapping out for the War Mother's Call, number 2 at 11 life, but of course it immediately generates a huge amount of board presence in this deck you basically can't miss, and there's Tryndamere, so, how does Blue Flower Dragon get through this? This is not one of those Piltover and Zone lists we've been seeing the whole tournament that has a ton of reach.
Yeah, if Topher can hit 2 more Tryndameres off the top, then Blue Flower Dragon is going to need a Harsh Winds to actually survive the turn, and that really hinders his setup, and he really needs a great setup if he's going to live through this turn. Topher has 2 Grasp of the Undyings, this Withering Wail, this Vengeance. Like, he can get through any board that Blue Flower Dragon wants to set up. He has, we'll have to see what comes off the top here in the following turn, but if it's literally anything other than a Soul Gorger and a second Ledros, Blue Flower Dragon's in a very, very rough position.
Yeah, and the hardest part of this, I think, although we are now, there's some value there in getting the Culling Strike to permanently kill the Anivia. There's no reanimation in this deck, so we won't be experiencing the board full of Anivias we've been witnessing from the Bald Eagle decks. But this is a different kind of issue, as another Anivia comes off the top, and you have to build a giant board to be proof against this Tryndamere attack. But if you commit too heavily, as you pointed out, Topher can kind of just Ruination his own board for value and then still get in. So it really is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, which of course is what you're shooting for with a late game as pronounced as this deck is built towards.
Yeah, and Topher with the 3 Withering Wails in hand, although his Anivia was killed, does still have the option to destroy the entire board of Blue Flower Dragon by stringing a couple of those together. And nothing that Blue Flower Dragon really sets up to combat the next turn is going to make a difference. That the board of Topher is too big at this point. It's a little bit too out of control. Topher might not even fire off the Withering Wails, might just let, Blue Flower Dragon throw his entire board under this bus. And if the Tryndamere does die here, if that is the case and how we're going to see this played, just so we can get the Ledros dead and maybe play it again on the following turn, I don't think this Ruination's ever coming out, but I think we're kind of past the point of it mattering.
Yeah, it seems like that's the point of this deck, right? Is that you need as few slots as possible to win, and these cards in hand are not necessary to actually take out Blue Flower Dragon. The deck was actually built for the phase of the game we've already gotten past, where you're potentially under threat while you try and work into a position to resolve this 12 mana spell. But unfortunately, the Frostbite control deck, just not the best list for pressuring this kind of deck through a preponderance of AoE removal, and so Topher is picking up a pretty free victory, it looks like, in the first game here.
Yeah, and Topher more than happy to make this trade. Doesn't push through as much damage with the Tryndamere, but the Ledros dying is sort of what he wanted. He does still have 10 mana for the turn, is going to be able to play that and knock Blue Flower Dragon down to 4. Could also go for the Atrocity Lethal, as Blue Flower Dragon is at 9, but, you know, there is a possibility that there's some... Never mind. There is a possibility of a Flash Freeze. I think there was one copy in Blue Flower Dragon's deck that I saw.
Is it available? There's a pause. I mean... Oh no, unfortunately not. The Farron is the one out, right? Like, or it's sort of the best out in terms of dealing some reach. That's the one of in the deck of Blue Flower Dragon, is sort of, I guess, a concession to this late game scenario. But yeah, a little bit too little too late there when you're dealing with Atrocity on Tryndamere.
Yeah, it was a little bit awkward as well because Topher, with the Double Grasp and the Triple Whale, did have 15 points of healing in his hand, as well as a Soul Gorger on field. So we are going to see a decline on the challenge and then get back into it. Looks, you know, the friend challenge system of Runeterra can be a little bit buggy, but Topher going to switch over to that Ezreal Karma, and we're going to see what Blue Flower Dragon has prepared to sort of beat this one out. It could be the mirror, it could be a run back on the Frostbite control. I'm not convinced that either one is super favored against the Ezreal Karma, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask your opinion of, is on Boulevard. Like, obviously, the mirror match, these two lists fairly similar in tech, could go either way. A little bit of luck at the draw, a little bit of, you know, personal flair. But this is the matchup that's probably going to decide this encounter. Can the Frostbite control deck do any better against this sort of... It's another slow, hand-centric list. So again, the Frostbite deck kind of mismatched, but is it an easier matchup?
So the Frostbite control deck has been praised historically for its flexibility. You do have the ability to, you know, out-control these board-centric decks, but you also, if you play on curve, because you are a Trifarian Assessor deck, you have so many 5-attack units in your deck, it's very possible for you to just, you know, push through what your opponent has.
Right, sort of in a similar way to how we saw these other, like, Freljord Noxus mid-range decks performing yesterday with Braum and Swain. You don't have that, like, guaranteed string of extremely high health units coming out, or the extra value from the newly buffed Braum, but the same principle, I'm sure, applies. These are just large statted units that can be run out of the Blue Flower Dragon deck. Not so much that one.
I mean, if you get a Thermogenic Beam out of Topher here, you're not going to feel too bad about it. That is, you know, sort of the power of this deck, is even on turn 2, you have 5-attack units coming down. I don't think Blue Flower Dragon... I had seen someone running Trifarian Assessors again, or not Trifarian Assessor, Trifarian Rear... the 5-4, the 3-mana 5-4 that can't block.
Yeah, that's not in this deck.
Yeah, that's not in this deck, but it is an adaptation that we've seen some players, you know, bring out sort of as an answer to a deck like this, where, you know, it is a hard-to-remove unit. It does push through a lot of damage, and there's only one health potion in the deck. That's about as far as the healing goes. We don't see any Eye of the Dragons coming out, you know, in the opening hand of Topher, and it looks like he's contemplating really hard whether or not he actually wants to Thermo Beam this, or if he's fine going down to 15 life.
Yeah, because that is something I was going to ask, is sort of, does this Ezreal Karma deck, like you mentioned, okay, you have to respect the Frostbite control deck, at least historically, to some degree. It has a mid-range, Polaris is going to beat you down. How much do you have to change your gameplay to account for that? Because this Ezreal Karma deck has been preying on the slower decks with the inevitability of the turn 10 leveled Karma, leveled Ezreal win condition. That seems a little bit slow if Blue Flower Dragon can curve out.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are hard to remove. We do see the Avarice and Trapper come down, and the 5/5 is one of the cards that's probably best suited for, you know, throwing a wrench in the works of the Karma Ezreal deck. Being able to get that down as early as turn 4, there's really not much you can line up except for Thermo Beam. And as we scale into, I would say around turns 5, 6, 7, that when Blue Flower Dragon's constantly throwing out units that have 5 toughness as well, that's when things start to really... That's when we start to see if the game is going to be decided by Blue Flower Dragon, or if Topher is going to be able to just sort of continue to curve out, get these Ezreal targets off. And we do see him stun the Trifarian Glory Seeker so that he can play the Ezreal on the following turn and get that Mystic shot down onto a unit that it can actually kill.
Yeah, okay, so this is where we actually are going to see the Ezreals played out preemptively as removal, more or less, and to maybe draw some sort of cards out of Blue Flower Dragon that are not, you know, tanky attacking units. So that is one question answered. But are you happy to do that? Obviously, you'd rather hold these Ezreals until the late game and not commit your mana to them.
Yeah, there's not a lot that Blue Flower Dragon can do to kill them. It's really just Reckoning and Culling Strike. If a Brittle Steel comes down onto it, it feels unfortunate, but not game-breaking. It is a little bit tough for Blue Flower Dragon to actually deal with these, and the amount of value that they can rack up in the meantime is absolutely absurd. And since we do have the 2 copies in hand, I think he's going to be much more likely to actually throw them down. Oh, excuse me. And it's not that big of a mana commitment for him. It is 5 mana. You do take out a unit, but once that happens, then, just every turn, it's probably the best way to consistently get your Ezreal targets racked up. It's just a matter of, does my opponent have the Culling Strike for it?
Looks like he's considering a Thermo Beam even now to take out this 5/1, which seems to run counter to the Ezreal plan if you're going to spend this, as you mentioned, one of the few removal spells that actually can card efficiently answer the larger followers out of Blue Flower Dragon's deck, but he pulls the trigger. So Topher maybe wanting to hold the Ezreal?
Yeah, that does seem to be the case. I guess he's valuing getting the Shadow Assassin down on turn 4, which is perfectly fine. It is going to draw a card, kind of accelerate you. The one thing that he is going to be looking for is that Karma. Blue Flower Dragon really doesn't have much to answer that outside of, like a Brittle Steel into a Culling Strike, or, he would have to combine multiple cards. Maybe Sejuani comes down to attack it, but we do see the Concussive Palm to contest that. And overall, Topher, as soon as he finds this Karma, he's going to feel good. Probably going to even slam that down on turn 6, since he will have the attack token, and Sejuani's not going to be able to pick it off immediately.
Is there any concern that, especially if you play Karma straight away on turn 6, that it's going to run into one of the Reckonings that are otherwise seem like they might be rotting in Blue Flower Dragon's hand?
It really depends on how the board state comes down at that point. We haven't seen Blue Flower Dragon have a lot of success in keeping 5 attack units around. So far, it's just that Glory Seeker that we've seen. Of course, it is still a little early in the game for him to be slamming those down, but unless a Hearthguard comes down on 5, it can be a little difficult to actually keep around multiple 5 attack units for that Reckoning to be a viable option. And with a couple of Rummages in hand, it's possible that Topher can find a Will of Ionia or a Deny, or literally any of the cards in his deck that can stop this out.
Well, we have seen the Avaros and Trapper, so presumably Blue Flower Dragon has a Yeti somewhere at this point, maybe holding onto it for that situation. But there's the Hearthguard as well, so first 5 power unit out, or 5/5 unit out.
Yeah, and that's actually really big. Getting this Avaros and Hearthguard down on 5 is sort of step 1 towards winning the Karma Ezreal matchup, or any removal packed matchup, just because it makes your units a little bit more resilient. Things don't line up from your opponent as well, and more importantly, it actually does make those Trifarian Assessors 5/4s on their own right, so even if you top deck them a little bit later, they'll still be at least drawing you 1 card.
Yeah, some cards are just like naturally more powerful on curve than others, and this is one of them, right? A real linchpin of the deck that gives it that backup plan. And if you can roll a couple of these together, right? We mentioned the relative efficiency of damage removal versus non-damage based removal from the Shadow Isle decks versus sort of Piltover and Ionia decks, and this is where maybe the difference can be exploited. It's really only Will of Ionia that answers these units efficiently, and you don't really want to recur that Avarice and Hearthguard summon effect.
Absolutely not, and Topher has a hand and a board that is very poorly poised into a Reckoning if that is something that Blue Flower Dragon wants to run out. If Topher does throw down both Shadow Assassins, I think it's actually pretty likely that if Flower Dragon has the Reckoning, we're going to see it thrown out. Will of Ionia has the counter for it a little bit later on, but I don't think either player is going to be terribly upset with the trade. We see the Yeti come down, but that doesn't actually impact the potential of a Reckoning in terms of mana.
Yes, and now it means that the Will is no longer as effective a counter because you can't bounce both units in response. So maybe Blue Flower Dragon setting that up, or maybe just prepping a board. It's hard to tell, and I'm sure that they are leaning on that uncertainty at the moment.
Okay, we are going to see Trifarian Assessor drawing a couple of cards, so no Reckoning just yet. Does mean Topher's going to be able to keep his board, and he's going to have to throw a couple of these under the bus if he wants to survive as Blue Flower Dragon. We talk about the 5 attack units being this great utility thing for the Trifarian Assessor and the Reckoning, but at the end of the day, they're units with 5 attack. You only have 20 life. As soon as 4 of those connect, you are dead and the game is over.
Yeah, it's kind of like this deck's strange version of this 3 of Shadow Assassin that we see uniformly in every different build of the Ionia Piltover decks. It's just the idea that throughout the game you're going to be pushing these hard-to-block attacks. In this case, they're hard to block because it's difficult to deal with these high-stat units favorably, and over time you're just going to create a second mounting pressure on your opponent besides that primary game plan, whether that be the Frostbite control deck or the eventual Ezreal combo. Ashe as well now.
Yeah, the Ashe win condition is, a pretty important surprise factor. Unfortunately, Blue Flower Dragon hasn't done much in the way of frostbiting just yet, so we don't get to see even a potential like harsh winds blowout here by Blue Flower Dragon, but he can set up for something like that. And Ash is sort of the primary Will of Ionia target in this deck. As you had mentioned, some of these units, they're expensive, they're big statted, but they have powerful enter abilities, and you don't necessarily want to give your opponent the ability to recycle them. You don't want a second Hearthguard coming down. This Yeti, while it's big, is only 1 mana. It's not that bad for him to throw it back down. And I think we might see Topher Will of Ionia preemptively to stop the Frostbite.
Yeah, I can definitely see, like, Topher, I'm sure, is considering, we even saw last game, the one of Captain Farron come out from Blue Flower Dragon. In that game, it was, a little bit sad to see, right before Blue Flower died to Atrocity. But in this game, the card represents a real threat, right? Like, Topher is still, away off his own win condition, and 3 Decimates represents a significant chunk of life, as well as another hard-to-deal-with body. If you take, 10-ish damage from this attack, you're automatically in kill range.
Yeah, and Blue Flower Dragon, it's, he looks like he's got a good board here. It kind of depends on how this attack actually goes, what Topher has to commit to. Sort of preserving his life total does have still a little bit of removal available to him, but as you mentioned, he's pretty far off of this Ezreal plan. If I've done my math correctly, he's only sitting at about 3, maybe 4 targets, and it's going to be a while before he can actually get that online. These rummages in hand, as good as the card is with Karma, it sometimes feels like a liability without it. We haven't seen Chump Wump get drawn yet either, and there's really no great discard targets if he wants to fire these off, so drawing both of them is really playing against him here.
Yeah, even then, like, we have a Get Excited in hand as well. I mean, you can discard one of your redundant Ezreal since you decided not to play it earlier, but I imagine that Topher at this point might be thinking back to those turns, or maybe we'll think back to them when reviewing this match later on and wonder how things could have lined up differently if there had been an Ezreal that had already generated a couple of extra Mystic shots, since the hand is so short on answers right now. You'd love a second Thermo Beam.
Yeah, and I'm actually kind of curious to see if Topher lines up and locks in these blocks as they are, if he is going to throw down an Ezreal, because he is currently trying to push through 6 elusive damage with these Shadow Assassins. Looks like he is contemplating lining up one of the blocks, but, if you do hold back all of these Shadow Assassins, go down to 7, and play the Ezreal, you are pushing your opponent down to 7 as well, just based off of the elusive damage. Then the Mystic Shot comes out of the Ezreal, then the Get Excited in hand, and you have the Ezreal's Mystic Shot on backup. You have a potential lethal play in that case.
Yeah, you would be vulnerable to Reckoning in that moment, although, it's not certain the Blue Flower Dragon knows no Deny is available. There is only one in the deck, so I guess you have that to play around still. But other than that, like you mentioned, not that much removal available for the Frostbite control deck that will, like, out and out stop that play. You pretty much have to commit an expensive Harsh Winds, which only buys time, or, have that big blowout.
I think it would actually have to be Harsh Winds, because he could play the Ezreal right now and then just go for a straight up open attack. Reckoning being a slow spell, he wouldn't have the opportunity to throw it down before all the damage connects, and by then you have the Ezreal's Mystic Shot from the other Ezreal, you have the fleeting Mystic Shot, and you have the damage to finish off your opponent. Though I do think we saw some kindly Tavern Keepers out of Blue Flower Dragon, and that is a card that could disrupt the strategy since you are going for exact lethal.
Yeah, there's a couple of them there, so if one of them has been lurking in hand and Blue Flower Dragon either picked it up later on or made the decision to sandbag it early, knowing that this is the kind of deck that sometimes does play for, exact lethal with burn spells, has to commit a lot of resources to deal finite damage, it is a potent card to hold back in hand, despite being kind of small ball compared to the other followers that the deck has available, and Blue Flower Dragon just concedes. So I guess there's no answer to the Ezreal, and you just sense the hand is full of burn?
That's definitely not when I expected the game to end. I felt like Blue Flower Dragon still had potential to come back into it, and that could just be given, because we had perfect information of Topher's hand. He had a really weak hand, but, sitting on the other side of the table, maybe the frustration just got to Blue Flower Dragon, but it does feel like an early surrender to me.
Yeah, running back the Frostbite control deck immediately after it was in such a... That was a really demoralizing game one. Like, Blue Flower had no hope and looked like, they kind of bricked their hand as well. So to immediately run back game 2 after quitting the challenge game 1 and then come back, play the same deck, you can sense there might be a bit of a tilt factor there. So, I mean, obviously that's unfortunate. It looks like... I mean, you take those if you're Topher, assuming nothing weird happened, right? That wasn't a disconnect. That was an intentional surrender, 100%.
I'm not sure if it matters either way. I think because they were so far into the game, even if it was a disconnect, then it still will be considered a loss. But we're gonna go ahead and hop over to Bruised by God, who is still in his top 16 match.
Yeah, and Bruised by God, if there's one player who I wanted to follow, coming into this top 16, Bruised by God is someone we definitely needed to check in on, because out of all of our 5 players at 6-1, I think Bruised had the most impressive record yesterday, beating 4 other players in the top 16 back to back to back to back to close the day out, really spoiling a lot of dreams and looking dominant in some of the most important matchups in this format.
Yeah, and Bruised by God, of course, last weekend, I've praised him before for bringing out that Bald Eagle deck, the first player to do it, got second place with it, and now bringing out the counter to the Karma Ezreal in this Braum Swain deck that we've seen a couple of players, find their way into the top cut with, and BBG just not sticking with one deck for too long is constantly evolving the meta.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like the right choice, because as much as we really anticipated that Bald Eagle would be a dominant deck ever on Broad, it seemed like the outright best thing to be doing in Shadow Isles Freljord. Apart from Topher, who we just watched play War Mother's Control, there seemed to be a consensus on that. And it seemed very likely that everyone would be bringing the combination of Shadow Isles Freljord and Ionia Piltover. But while Ionia Piltover remained, relatively popular as one of the decks in most lineups, people really went away from this Bald Eagle deck, either just not having time to get reps in on it, as you mentioned, it's relatively new, waiting for a deck to be pinned down, or just thinking that there might be counters available. We've got a Sea Monsters player in the top 16. We've got a lot of this Braum Swain deck, which people, didn't bring to counter the Bald Eagle, but brought to counter the Ionia Piltover lists, and even these aggro players doing well. So, for Bruise to be switching away from that deck, maybe prescient, I guess, of the meta that would arrive.
Yeah, and now we do see this Solitary Monk does mean that BBG should be relatively safe to throw down the Heimerdinger. Doesn't actually have any inherent protection for it with the Twin Disciplines, but there's not a whole lot that Kelvin can have to take this out. I think it is just Thermogenic Beam from his own deck. These Twisted Fate Ezreals typically don't play Get Excited on their own. Could have stolen one from BBG, but he's going to be able to get some turret value immediately anyway, thanks to this Flash of Brilliance. Gets the Hextech Transmogulator, and that's probably one of the weaker 6-cost spells. We were talking a lot yesterday about how these randomly generated spells can be the swinging factor in a matchup. This one definitely looks more like discard fodder.
Yeah, there's probably some scenario where you have some sort of weak, the 2-cost turret, and maybe you generate a Rex or something, and then you swap them around. But, exactly, at that point with 6 mana, it's such a variable outcome that you'd rather just, throw it away to cast your Get Excited.
And BBG looks absolutely devastated by this Thermogenic Beam.
You mentioned it's a pretty high roll for Kelvin to have exactly stolen Thermo Beam. There are 3 Thermo Beams, in Kelvin's deck. So I shouldn't say there's not necessarily a stolen Thermo Beam. that isn't an option, and this is actually something that we've seen players flex on with this Ezreal Twisted Fate list, is how many and which spells they play. The follower lineup seems fairly consistent. Everyone's on the Pilfer package, everyone's on Riptide Rex, makes a lot of sense. But then it's which and how many spells do you play? We haven't got the full dedication to leveling Ezreal, playing Parlay I believe a Megadrax, the other STF player in the top 16, is doing, but do run that full complement of Thermo Beams, and that seems like a really heads-up play with all these high toughness followers running around.
And with this Petty Officer pulling out a Bark Beast, BBG actually trades his Get Excited for the damage onto the Vi. He's going to be able to push through with his Floor Be Gone, but his Vi is going to be the one to suffer for it. Whereas previously it would have been able to take out that Bark Beast for free, not take any damage because it is a tough unit. But now we're actually even going to see the punish, the Make It Rain. BBG not being able to push through the extra damage with his Elusive, which is why he committed this Get Excited so early and pushed the extra damage onto his Vi, and things are just not working out for him so far in this matchup.
Do you feel like he was forced to make that kind of play just because the life total is so disparate right now? And the hand is pretty empty for BBG as well. You're going to discount these deep meditations and hopefully find something, but this looks like a spot where you kind of have to roll the dice.
Yeah, I think the discount on the Deep Meditations is extremely important. We are going into the Riptide Rex turn next time around, and while the Vi is generally pretty good at preserving your life total through that just because she eats multiple shots, now down to 2 HP, she's only going to eat a couple of those. That's going to be 5 damage pushed through at BBG, which, you add up to 6 once the warning shot comes out, and he could just be dead on the next turn if he doesn't find something really impactful off these Deep Meditations, and I'm hard-pressed to imagine what he actually could find that would be enough.
Oh, and the Powder Kick is... Oh, okay, gets the 1-drop. Yeah, I guess this attack is looking pretty powerful. Obviously doesn't know the BBG's out of blockers, but we'll probably surmise that now. Vi up to 10 power, at least.
Yeah, and I think BBG is actually going to have to throw out the Twin Disciplines and buff up the defense of the Vi, get her leveled up, as opposed to firing off these deep meditations. We'll have the opportunity to do it next turn, as the Mystic Shot Twin Disciplines does mean he's played 2 spells this turn as well. But Kelvin continuing to go wide on the board and actually just not attacking.
That really strongly implies the Riptide Rex lethal, right?
I would have to assume, especially since, and this does actually play really poorly for BBG, who didn't get off the Twin Discipline because his opponent didn't attack, and now does not have access to the reduced cost deep meditations.
Do you think that might have even been a really big brain read from Kelvin? With BBG, those deep meditations have been in the hand for what looks like most of the game, and when you see your opponent flurrying out low-value thermo beams and stuff, maybe you figure out, oh, these spells aren't really being cast for their own purposes. I'm going to deny my opponent maybe the opportunity to play a combat trick and get that discount.
It's a little hard to say. I feel like if the Riptide Rex was going to be the follow-up play, then I would have liked to see the attacks even more. You don't really care that the Vi is going to be coming out. Maybe, kind of expecting a Spirit's Refuge that we do see now in BBG's hand to sort of be the play on the block, which would level the Vi, give BBG, 10 life back up to 18, and then things would play out pretty poorly for him. Maybe he had a proactive answer that he didn't have the mana for if BBG did throw out a Spirit's Refuge on the attack turn.
Now.
But the Spirit's Refuge should be enough. BBG's going to come out with a higher life total than he sort of started with on this one.
Well, maybe I'm assuming there has to be an answer, right? If you were playing around this lifesteal before and now you're willing to swing into Vi, I mean, the board is wider to push damage past her, but you're hoping to maybe mop her up. There has to be a follow-up spell to this, and we're going to see the Twin Disciplines burst out and make it as hard as possible to remove this Vi. I'm struggling to imagine what could happen mid-combat to clear away a 5 toughness Vi through a deny as well. So this looks like a lot of life being gained by BBG here.
And he's actually going to use the deny to stop the Make It Rain, not wanting to lose the barrier, not wanting to commit the Twin Disciplines. And it's definitely a decision to be made here. Do you care about the Twin Disciplines more, or do you care about the deny more? This is an Ezreal deck. I'm inclined to say that the deny is what you want to be hanging on to. It doesn't play as well into the Heimerdinger if you do end up top decking it a little bit later on. But I do think it still has a lot of good targets that you need to be wary of, like especially Static Shock, just digging your opponent a little bit deeper, still being able to push damage at your face while they try to find a Riptide Rex.
Yeah, that seems like the thing that you're playing around is maybe even just the draw spells rather than, removal, whereas the Twin Disciplines is only really effective for preserving the unit. May as well commit it now when that's your goal. And here's the Pilfered Good, so unfortunately you can't deny that one. He was hoping for the Static Shock, perhaps, like you mentioned. And maybe, Kelvin, there's a lot of burn in both decks. The lethal could have gotten a little bit closer there.
And the second Vi really not going to get too much done for BBG. The Vault Breaker, as you had mentioned, there's this massive life disparity in between the two players, and BBG's not going to be able to, surprise out a lethal with a couple of Vault Breakers onto the Shadow Assassin. And I don't think he really wanted to attack this turn, wanted to just make his opponent float all this mana, but he does have to start pressuring the life total, and, knocking his opponent down to 13 does mean that he could potentially find lethal on the next turn. And I think he fired off that Deep Meditation. I'm actually not sure what he was looking for. I thought an additional copy of Spirit's Refuge would be sort of the one that he's been looking for, but he only runs one copy of the card.
Maybe trying to grab another Twin Disciplines if he is trying to, really put pressure on the life total.
Perhaps, yeah, maybe just looking for any amount of burn that he can to know if he's okay to fire off these Vault Breakers. Ooh. And that is a Will of Ionia and a Deny stolen from BBG that are going to absolutely demolish his chances at winning this game, getting that Vi back into the hand. And now Kelvin still has a very wide board. BBG's going to have to commit the Thermogenic Beam here.
Yeah, this is such a tempo loss as well. You can see BBG's face. Like, he's obviously not given up completely, but his face fell when that all resolved. You can't really play around the stolen deny. His third copy pinched off the top, and it leaves him in such a terrible spot considering the board state and his life total. It's hard to see how he comes back. There is only one card left for Kelvin. We don't know, how valuable it is, so maybe if you can get down something, but you're out of mana, and yeah, the attack's coming through next turn. Any additional damage is lethal.
Yeah, 1 damage is not where you want to be against decks that run Warning Shot in the main.
Yeah, exactly.
But BBG going to play it out, line up the blocks. Does know that he still has, a chance at winning this game, as small as it is. But there is the Twin Discipline, and that is going to be lethal. Kelvin really just stealing all of the ideal cards. Gets that third deny, that Will of Ionia, now finding lethal out of BBG's deck. And that feels like a massive mental defeat.
Yeah, BBG looks confused a little bit there. I'm sure he'll bounce back and immediately sort of like gathers himself. But that must be rough to first have the deny stall on the third copy, and then with your own deny in hand is like BBG is like last out. But he's maybe sort of building himself up to play towards. You steal the burst spell, undeniable, no burn spells in the hand for BBG. Has to just die to that. And yeah, that's not how you want to start out your top 16 after you were probably the most dominant day one player. But BBG, of the people who went 6-1, is the one who's playing sort of one of two players, I guess, who's playing like this conventional Valheimer deck. And, I guess in some cases that makes you vulnerable because this is the deck that probably had the biggest target on it going into the tournament.
Yeah, and it looks like it is going to sort of not play out for him here. It does end up falling 2-1 to his opponent. Ooh. We're trying to see if we can actually find a backup stream, but it looks like a lot of the players have sort of finished up their games at this point, which makes a fair amount of sense. We did watch.
Yeah, we watched a couple of games play out.
Sorry, I was looking at the chat.
Yeah, so it looks like obviously you don't have sound turned on, but BBG obviously highlighting the Brown Swain deck, and we've seen it's funny, more than one player after we've watched their games in this tournament has gone back to the deck screen and kind of just popped open the Brom Swain list and just looked at all the cards and had a little talk to their chat. Like this deck is doing some work, and I have to imagine that got the one win for BBG. Again, it's not certain how this will impact future metas, obviously, since we're not even certain what future formats will look like, but this is a deck that people really should be taking notice of, especially if the Weimerdinger deck isn't working out for people and they decide to switch over to the other the Ezreal Karma build of Piltover Ionia.
And this is why I like tournaments so much more than ladder. You get these cool intricacies of like, I don't think Brom Swain is a very good ladder deck. I think that it is kind of a specific counter to some of these Ionia Piltover Zon decks. It can stand up to the aggro lineups, but I don't think you're actually going to find a tremendous amount of success with it on ladder. Obviously, you can hit masters with anything if you're a good enough player, but my point is more that it's one of these really cool adaptations that we really only see come out in tournaments. Things like Topher's War Mother's Call deck. That's really not something you're going to run into on ladder. It's not that effective. Its range of matchups is pretty narrow, and I really like seeing those decks specifically come out. They really highlight the skills of the players that have taken the prep time and really gone all in on determining the best tournament lineup.
Yeah, like Topher's lineup as a whole, obviously, he did take a couple of losses yesterday, but I really like the pairing of War Mother's Control, which looks like it just has like the mother of all matchups, pardon the pun, against any board-based, follower-based deck, right? Like, how do you fight through that much AoE removal? And obviously, at some point you fit in the one War Mother's Call once they're out of resources. Very classic control style. And then the other deck, it's another control deck, but it's the Ezreal Karma deck, which, as we've kind of established, has the capacity to prey on all of the other slow lists. Just because you reach a point where Bald Eagle can be setting up its thing, and the Weimerdinger deck obviously has game even in the late stages. But if you find any window, once you've sculpted your hand, you just run out Ezreal, run out Karma, and win the game, and it's very hard to play around in some cases. We were watching, I think, Nola Gold lost a heartbreaking win into one of the players we might see later on in the top 16, Dylan Ed, in exactly that fashion. Even over many, many, many turns, the Ezreal Karma deck came out ahead of this, scary Anivia reanimation plan. So pairing those two slow decks together might feel like you're bringing the same thing twice, but they actually, really effectively counter whatever your opponent has. It'd be hard to get 2 wins in.
Yeah, and speaking of the War Mother's deck, something that I've noticed a little bit that I'm kind of curious about is when you see a pretty popular regional composition like Shadow Isle Freljord, and then you run sort of the lesser known version of this. War Mother's Call has been a deck that's sort of popped up sparingly throughout a couple of formats, but typically it was when Endure Spiders was the top dog of that regional composition. We've seen a lot of barrel control come out of players when Sea Monsters was still, sort of the king of the Bilgewater Shadow Isle, and there is some merit to running these lesser known decks in a powerful regional composition. I just am not sure that they really offer as much to a lineup as sort of the deck that is predominant in the meta within those regions, and it can play against you just because the power level of the deck might not be there, and the surprise factor, while it can have a lot of value, doesn't always represent enough to win a match.
Yeah, and I mean, the surprise value is only, going to last so long when your opponent mouses over your deck and sees, oh, that's not Braum Anivia, that's Tryndamere Anivia. What am I playing against here? I mean, even if it wasn't an open decklist tournament, someone who's savvy is going to figure things out pretty fast. And I think maybe some players, and especially in a mature meta such as we're in, or a meta that people don't like, people get hung up on the idea that they're going to break it or they're going to find an answer outside of what's known. just because like so many people are over preparing for these Weimerdinger matchups, these Bald Eagle matchups. It's scary to go into the tournament with that list if you don't have a ton of reps, and maybe that's why you see some players default to these older decks that maybe they have more experience on, and they know that people won't be at least specifically targeting. It has turned out to be something of an even split. We had 4 out of 16 players who showed up with that SI Freljord combo and Ionia PZ as their lineup. And one of them was, Topher, who's not really playing the stock Shadow Isle Freljord deck. And, a comparative number of them had neither of those combos. And in the top 4 in the 6-1 lineup, we had, 2 players bringing full out aggro with Scouts and Darius. And that's really interesting when you mentioned yesterday, those are sort of decks you'd expect to be the third deck of a 3-deck lineup that people might drop for a tournament like this.
Yeah, and it looks like Topher is going to be getting into his match relatively soon here. Sorry to kind of not expand on your point, but you've done a phenomenal job of kind of stalling while I figured out, the kind of opponent that he's going to be playing. And it looks like we are going to be getting into a harrowing Darius and Heimer Vi matchup for Topher here, who is currently getting into contact with his opponent. We will be seeing that one come out in just a couple of minutes. He's kind of sitting at that screen, getting everything ready for his match.
Yeah, Topher lining up against Italian X, who did finish on top of the ladder. Yes, ended up being tied with a bunch of players at 6-1, but really had a strong play throughout the day. Took out a couple of these other top 16 players early on in things, and combining that harrowing Darius with the Weimerdinger list, not on Scouts as a few of the other players who brought aggro are, so didn't double down. But I mean, this harrowing Darius deck, we managed to avoid seeing it on stream all day, but it did some work. 5 players in the top 16, 3 6-1s playing the deck.
Yeah, that's definitely, pretty impressive for a deck that's kind of making its debut here. And I'm not, once again, these decks are relatively new. I'm not super familiar with the matchups, so it's a little bit harder for me. Like, I can look at a deck list and kind of reason out how it's actually going to play out into something, but I can't say it with 100% certainty because, these matchups are pretty new to me. I haven't watched them a whole lot. I definitely haven't played them a whole lot, as Darius Harrowing is a deck that I have not touched myself just yet.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's. I mean, then it presents a learning opportunity for us, I guess. But we can kind of surmise, right? Because at least this deck's game plan is fairly transparent. You're looking to curve out with these Noxus units, and that the key factor that almost all of them advertise is that these units guarantee damage on attack. You can't. This is not like that Frostbite control list where a lot of the time, okay, these are big bodies, but you can always stall them. You can throw your Avarosan guards in front of them. You can throw your 1/1s or your Shadow Assassins if you're not using them to push lethal. You have options. Against these decks, all these units trigger damage on attack, or they trigger damage on death, or there's a Crimson Disciple, and then at the top end of the curve, everything has Overwhelm. So, when they attack you, you're just guaranteed to take a certain amount of damage, and then they have spells like Transfusion and Noxian Fervor to respond to your removal. So it becomes very difficult to kind of shut down their clock. Outside of copious healing, which maybe the Shadow Isles decks can bring. You can see how these Darius decks are able to just plow through a tournament and get win after win.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the sort of adaptation of aggro across the history of Legends of Runeterra. It seems like keywords have always been the defining factor in these decks, and that's not necessarily something that we see in other card games. Initially the meta was dominated by what is effectively Flying and Fearsome, and now we're seeing Flying and Trample, sort of take over the meta because these are just difficult strategies to deal with. There aren't a lot of aggressively statted low drop units that you can use to contest against these sort of overstatted Trample units or these understatted Flyers, and with Elusive not being able to be available to every region, you're just kind of relying on your removal suite, and it's a problem that we've seen kind of pop up a couple of times over the course of the format. Elusives were one of the best decks on the beta release, then again on release, just making adaptations over and over, kind of cycling through the regions. Originally we saw Demacia Elusives, then back-to-back got nerfed, we moved over to Freljord, then a couple of those things got nerfed, now we're into Noxus even. Hasn't really come up much in this tournament just because Ionia and Noxus are really heavily contested regions for a tournament lineup, so it's understandable that we didn't see a lot of Crimson Elusives. Kinku Elusives definitely fits into lineups a little bit better. And I know you took a look at the top 16 decks a little bit earlier. Do we have any Kinku Elusives in the top 16?
No, I don't think so. We had one Kinku Elusives player show up yesterday, but I believe they fell relatively early on. So and not many Elusives overall. In fact, none in the top 16. We didn't see Crimson Elusives basically all day. We saw the Poro Elusives deck, obviously, that our friend Orbmeister was running. Unfortunately, he ended up bombing out of the tournament. And the Crimson Elusives, I believe, was that we saw playing opposite Orbmeister, also just fell out of contention at the end of the day. So It's interesting as to why those decks didn't get it done and the Noxus deck did, because they're both sort of relying on a similar factor where they are building a board that's hard to remove, and then they have evasive keywords so that they're hard to block, and they're putting pressure on the amount of healing and removal that you have. But I think the deciding factor might just be that the Noxus units are much better statted for their cost at a base level. Whether that's because the devs believe that Overwhelm is a fundamentally less powerful keyword than Elusive, it probably is. But that actually helps you a lot more against the damage-based removal that's come to define this meta. Whereas, we saw, those Elusive decks do very well when they're able to get to their hatchling turn and land those big buffs, or when maybe they get some fortunate runs with Omen Hawk or burst buffs in response. But they're still vulnerable to having their cards picked off. And the fact that the current prominent control decks, a lot of them do run Shadow Assassin as a 3 of, probably doesn't help.
Yeah, I know that Shadow Assassin is kind of a card that's on a lot of players' radars, especially even for this upcoming balance patch that we should be getting on Wednesday, where Shadow Assassin, I know that Riot had come out and said that it was the most played card throughout the beta stages of Legends of Runeterra, and while the card had a bit of a dip-off once Rising Tides came out, as people kind of, adapted to a faster meta, we've definitely seen Shadow Assassin make a massive resurgence in quite a few decks nowadays, coming out in pretty much every Ionia list, be it control or aggressive. I think it's just offering a little bit too much versatility for just a 3-mana card that draws a card.
Yeah, I do worry that if you remove that card, it might actually be worse for the format, because part of the reason for its prominence is surely the need to have any additional defense against elusive decks, which have almost always been part of the aggressive side of the competitive scene, right? Okay, it is completely free. It's a free card. People don't think very hard probably before slinging 3 in every Ionia deck. But if you don't have access to that, then you're even more vulnerable to getting rushed down by something like Crimson Elusives.
Yeah, absolutely. It is kind of this awkward line where you want to balance it as both an anti-aggro tool, something that you can splash into your control deck and feel good about without, just having all of these aggro decks splashing it and being able to maintain cards a little bit too well. And I know that's something we've talked a lot about with Crimson Elusives, is that thanks to the Shadow Assassin, as well as, looping that with things like Navori Conspirator and Solitary Monk, it can actually be almost impossible to run a burn deck out of cards, which is typically, very anti-synergistic of how burn decks operate. And here we are going to see Topher getting into game with Italian X, starting off with the Darius Harrowing, and Topher actually opening up with the Ruination, so does have the answer for the Harrowing when it does come out. Doesn't have a lot of tools to survive the early game, as nothing in this deck outside the Vile Feast costs less than 4 mana, but he's gotten this far. I'm sure he's run into this matchup a couple of times, and I'm excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah, this I mean, one way or the other, this must have been what Topher is hoping for, right? You can't get many more decks that are going to run into your AoE removal as hard as this deck will. Like, okay, you're definitely going to get hit a lot in the first few turns, but there's plenty of healing available. Triple Catalyst on top of triple Whale, triple Grasp, triple Vile Feast even. So it really does come down to, how well does Italian X play around these board rights? Because open deck lists, you're going to look at this, see all of the Ruinations and Avalanches and Boxes, and really have to think carefully about how you sequence your followers here.
Yeah, and really fortunate for Topher that he actually does open up with this Vile Feast, and, Italian X playing 2 1-health units is going to play very poorly for him here, as he does get the Legion Saboteur destroyed, followed by a block onto this Legion Grenadier, and, 2 for 1ing on the Vile Feast is a pretty typical play against some of these aggro decks, and Topher picks up this Catalyst of Aeons just in time. That's going to ramp him perfectly into the Soul Gorger turn on the following turn, although we have seen a lot of nerfs rolled back onto this Freljord version of the deck. War Mother's Call Control was sort of the best deck of the format way back in August of 2019 when they were doing sort of these early access weekends, and they had to nerf a lot of the Freljord cards. Catalyst of Aeons was one of the victims of that, going up to 4 mana, or going up to 5 mana from 4. And if we had seen that as one of the nerfs rolled back, Topher could even be in a better position now than he is.
Yeah, even so, though, it doesn't look like it's too bad. This meta choice is looking better and better. Here's the on-curve Basilisk Rider with the Allegiance trigger, one of the aggressive boogeymen of the current format. But if Topher wants, you can commit the Vengeance here, right? Like, this is why the card costs 7 mana. If you are playing in the way that this deck wants to play, this is, I believe, when the devs set out to say, what does a control deck look like, they probably drew it up exactly like this. We're going to Fading Memories, the Basilisk Rider. Wow. Does not get the Allegiance trigger, though.
Yeah, this is actually a little bit strange to me. So it is a little bit of a weird position for Topher. If you Vengeance, then you can't Catalyst on the following turn. I don't think you necessarily care that much about Catalysting on 5 anyway. I think I actually would have liked to see the Vengeance come out, because that lets you just float turn 5 and then throw out a potential Ruination on turn 6, because now we are still pretty far away from this Soul Gorger turn. And this is one of the problems with the 5-mana Catalyst, is it can get really awkward to find casting times for it, because you are trying to ramp into very specific turns. And, you know, the longer the game goes on, the worse it gets. It is still 3 points of healing at any stage of the game, but I think I would have liked to see the Vengeance come out.
Yeah, it does seem interesting, because you got to look, okay, ramp is good, but what are you ramping into? And obviously the big things that you're playing for in this game plan are either War Mother's Call or, you know, maybe the Ruination, like the answers in the deck. You're not really, I don't think, ever in a spot where you're, I'll ramp into this Tryndamere. Like that's what I'll run out against the Noxus deck, because, you know, you're not in the business of blocking these creatures. I suppose with how those early turns played out and how eager Italian X was to commit attacks and kill off those early followers, you maybe don't feel as pressured to play your board wipe, although now you will. The second Basilisk Rider begging for the Ruination, will have it banked for next turn, but gonna take some hits.
Yeah, this is where things get really scary for Topher. Just kind of an awkward stumble on the mana. You know, not committing the Vengeance to this Basilisk Rider does mean that he's going to pay for it now. This would be the turn where, you know, he's only going to take about 8 damage, but now he's going to tap out playing this Vengeance. And the Fading Memories play just really didn't seem to work out for him. It did, you know, have a very great short-term payoff, preventing any amount of damage coming through to him on that turn. But now with this Vengeance, you know, there's even potential for Italian X to throw out a copy of the... Actually, let me just make sure he runs it before I say it. Okay, never mind. Italian X does not run the Atrocity, which would have sort of been like the massive punish for this Vengeance coming out with 6 mana open. But, you know, Topher, it is awkward. You know, he's committing his entire turn to this. Ruination is still on the table for a couple of the following turns, but I think at this point he's got to save that for the Harrowing.
Yeah, it looks a lot like, you know, this is you've kind of missed the boat on the early Ruination play that can really generate a ton of value and kind of overpower. Like, whatever your opponent does to follow up that Ruination, if you play that turn 6... you feel ahead, because, you know, you've mopped up turns worth of development, and they're only playing, you know, a 6-drop or whatever in return because of the disparity between spell mana and like creature mana, follower mana. But now we're kind of past that point, and you're not necessarily preserving your life total or decreasing the clock, even if you ruin this whole board. So, you know, how else can you stall? Is this Soul Gorger lifesteal going to be enough? Can you set up a whale somehow? We really want to see one of the other damaging removal spells come out to maybe set up a combo play for Topher.
He does have access to Anivia Whale. The problem is that Crimson Disciple on the board of Italian X is going to sort of make him eat a lot of damage if that is the route that he wants to go. And this Anivia is only presenting 1 damaged board at the moment. It is not leveled, and it feels like he has to fire off the Ruination this turn. It will give Italian X a bit of a refuel turn. You know, can just throw out anything that he has in hand. And that's where things get really scary for Topher. He doesn't have a follow-up answer if the board goes wide and then a Darius comes down on the following turn. He's really in a rough position here. Even if he just had another Anivia in hand to get access to a Harsh Winds, I'd feel a little bit better about what he's got going on for him. But at the moment, Topher looks like he could be losing on the next couple of turns.
Is it desperate enough that you would risk committing the Anivia to the board and just hope to God that you top deck the second copy and you get the Harsh Winds as described?
I think I would. I think I would throw down the Soul Gorger if I was going to play a unit this turn, but I definitely think the Ruination is kind of the play. This is the card that I harp on players the absolute most for. I've seen so many games thrown by people trying to hang on to Ruination for just a turn too long, trying to get just a little bit too much value out of it. Topher is going to fire this one off for a pretty significant advantage. We see the Noxian Fervor come out as the response, and if that 6 mana left for Italian X is committed to a Darius, then Topher could just be dead here. Does have the Withering Wail to sort of get himself back out of range of the Darius, but okay, Basilisk Rider not as threatening.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of the reason we see so much healing in these Shadow Isles decks on top of everything else is it's not just about staying above 0 life, it's about staying above 10. Because if Darius ever levels, especially in the other players who have brought this Darius Harrowing deck are playing Atrocity, and that's a huge issue to play around in these controlling decks because obviously it makes cards like Vengeance much worse. But, you know, Italian X not on that particular threat. Still a terrifying, card to face down is the level up Darius, especially with the Harrowing available later on, or right now, actually. This is not the biggest Harrowing, but it's a pretty scary one considering the number of dead Basilisk Riders.
Yeah, and it looks like Italian X just says, I know you don't have 2 Ruinations, which is, in my opinion, a pretty ballsy call, given how long Topher has held on to some of these cards in his hand. That Soul Gorger and Tryndamere have been here pretty much since the beginning. But, you know, the the play is going to pay off for Italian X, who maybe even, reviving the Legion Grenadier set, even if you have the Ruination, I'm pushing through a fair amount of damage. It's a lot more likely that you have answers to my singular Basilisk Rider. Let me go for broke here.
Yeah, and I like going for down to 3 cards in hand, and one of which we know is obviously the Axe. Like, it looks like Italian X may just not really have a better option in hand, and rather than take a mediocre turn and maybe run into some trouble, better to fire off the Harrowing and just see if you have it. That sometimes you got to pull the trigger with an aggro deck, and it looks like this is going to be a bullet to the head of Topher. So the deck that you would expect most likely to beat this Harrowing Darius deck falls. The Harrowing is just such a nutty card in this meta.
Yeah, I've always been a big fan of the Harrowing. I don't like to see it necessarily used in this manner. I was always, there were a couple of Harrowing decks that I was a big fan of. I think Hecarim being one of my favorites because of the interaction with Hecarim. Getting all of these ephemeral units, he's basically going to auto level up. He's going to give all of your things +3 attack. And Hecarim himself has Overwhelm. But when you're just bringing out 6 Overwhelm units or a couple of Burn units, I've seen games ended because somebody will Harrowing and it's like, okay, well, you didn't have that much die. What are we really looking at here? And it's just a couple of copies of Legion Grenadier coming out, and it's like, okay, well, now I'm taking 4 damage that I can't do anything about.
I respect your opinion in not liking this, but I love it. I think it's the perfect kind of deck for a Harrowing, just because of what you described. It's all about the Overwhelm, right? Because the weakness of this card is if you're in a board-based matchup, say you're against Frostbite Control, something else, they have a lot of beefy followers, right? They're not necessarily just going to clear up the whole board to leave you open for a Harrowing attack. So, if you are generating a ton of ephemeral units for 9 mana, the risk is that if this doesn't work, if you don't kill them, you're tapped out, you've got an empty board, you're going to die on the backswing. But with this many Overwhelm units and the whole deck just being about every card trading consistently for damage, there's almost no way it doesn't work out. I mean, something like a Harsh Winds is maybe all that can save you, because otherwise you're just not going to have enough healthy blockers to line up against all of these, 6 power Overwhelm units.
Oh, yeah. No. Don't get me wrong. I think it's phenomenal. I think it is absolutely busted. I just don't like it. I don't like that it exists. I don't like that is an interaction that we can do where I can pay 9 mana to get 6 Overwhelm units and absolutely hard body you. Because I had spoken at length a little bit about on Reddit about how there's really not a lot that you can do about the Harrowing, especially if it's reviving a bunch of tougher Overwhelm units. Even if you have a board full of units, that's generally typically perceived to be the one answer to the Harrowing is like, yeah, I'll lose my entire board, but at least I survived the turn. And that's not the case with the Darius Harrowing deck. So you're going to lose your board and you're going to die.
With such a focus on the Harrowing and Reanimation, I somewhat wonder whether there might be room for more conditional, low-cost stunning and bouncing removal, just so that more decks have tech against this kind of play, because you have to answer these Basilisk Riders and stuff somehow, and a lot of decks would be able to deal with them if you just broke their playing on curve and prevented the damage for a turn. But killing them at this point just looks like you're digging your own grave for later on when the Harrowing gets online.
Yeah, I like that we have the concept of a death pool in Legends of Runeterra. It kind of opens us up to a couple of interesting design spaces. A little bit more Obliterate could come out to prevent things like this. We could even see cards potentially like Monster Reborn coming out, picking a card out of your death pool to revive. But so far, the Harrowing and Mistcall really all we got, and they're acting is more than enough in the format. But now into the game we have at hand, we do have this Karma Ezreal versus this Heimer Vi, and typically I feel like Heimer Vi has the advantage here. The proactivity feels a little bit better than the reactivity, especially given how few cards actually specifically kill the Heimerdinger in a matchup like this. We do see the Get Excited in Topher's hand, but that's really the only one. And so many turrets can come out so quickly that it's possible that you just don't have the mana lined up for your removal to actually take care of all of them.
Right. I'm not in any way saying that what you said isn't true, but I find that an interesting evaluation, because I feel like just from what people have said, a lot of players have brought this, chosen to bring this Karma Ezreal build of Piltover Ionia precisely because this is a Heimerdinger-dominated meta, and they feel that they like the matchup on their end. Just because I guess you have strategic clarity that all you have to do is hold removal, hold those Will of Ionias, hold those, denies, try and force through interaction that disrupts those tempo turns, and then the Heimerdinger player will be hard-pressed to stop the Karma Ezreal combo in the same way.
Yeah, the Karma Ezreal definitely feels a little bit more consistent, especially in a matchup like this. Like, if you do not find your Heimerdinger, it's extremely difficult for you to actually take advantage of that Vi backup win condition or that Solitary Monk, who I believe is currently visual bugged. I don't think there's any reason that she would have lost her elusive powers. But yeah, Topher's actually doing a really good job so far of actually hanging on to a fair amount of removal. He pretty much has the Ezreal level up in hand. I think he's got an additional 6 targets there on top of the one that he already fired off. But he hasn't actually killed the Solitary Monk yet, and it looks like he's not going to do that again this turn. I'm curious to see if we're just going to run out a train of concussive palms on this Monk and keep throwing these Tail of the Dragons at Italian X's face, or if we're going to hang on to one a little bit later for the Vi. And now that it is Italian X's turn, it looks like she has regained her elusiveness.
Yeah, okay, so whatever that bug was, we're past it now. It's interesting. You probably want to hold at least one of these palms in case there's a Vi. Like you mentioned, it's hard to win with the Vi, but she's still a very strong unit, and you want some answer to her. We don't have those Will of Ionias online yet, or at least in hand. But, it seems more than credible to me to hold back that Get Excited for Heimerdinger. You're really, with the amount of removal and healing in this deck, you're probably not that fast about a single Solitary Monk, and you know that you're never getting beat down by more than one of them at a time, so, at this point, Italian X kind of just building... Topher is kind of building his own board and just demanding Italian X to move first, which we've seen come up over and over again between these slow decks in the tournament.
Yeah, and with that 9 mana floated for Italian X, I think it's pretty much confirmed at this point that he doesn't have the Heimerdinger, and Topher is going to have the advantage just because he does have these Tails of the Dragon on board, and Italian X has shown an unwillingness to throw his Solitary Monk in front of them. Now that there are 2, this could change. When there's 1 and 1, you don't necessarily want to let the Concussive Palm just kill the Solitary Monk, but you do not want to be taking 6 damage a turn, especially against a deck that wants to finish you off with a little bit of burn. There's generally not any healing in this Karma or in this Heimer Vi deck outside of the Spirit's Refuge. We're definitely not seeing Eye of the Dragons come out. It's a little bit harder to proc. We're not seeing the health potion that we're seeing out of the Karma Ezreal. So Italian X playing with a pretty stagnant life total, and it's not out of the question that we could even see one of the Spirit's Refuge come down now, blocking onto this Tail of the Dragon.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all, especially because Italian X, I believe, is the only player running a full 3 copies of Spirit's Refuge. I mean, it's an expensive and situational spell. It's tough if you have it stuck in hand, and that might be your only spell to cast for Heimerdinger, or you may not even have a unit but want to heal. But yeah, with 3 of them available, you certainly feel more at liberty to throw them out in fringe situations, or just to preserve your life total in the mid game like this, as opposed to, like we saw Bruised by God earlier, it's kind of like a Hail Mary play on your fully charged Vi to try and swing the game back in your favor.
Yeah, and I think at this point, Topher is kind of smelling the blood in the water on the side of Italian X, knows he doesn't have the Vi, knows he doesn't have the Heimer, could be contemplating throwing down his Karma and trying to accrue a little bit of value off of that. Of course, the caveat is that, if Italian X doesn't have Heimer or Vi in hand, he has to have something in hand, and that something is probably going to be something that can kill your Karma.
That's true. Exactly. Italian X, saving all of these cards in their hand, probably speaks to a similar situation as Topher has in his hand, where both players are holding a lot of quite valuable cards that could proactively impact the board, but neither of them wants to spend that removal on, a 4-3 Monk or a 3-2 Monk, right? When the whole game in this matchup revolves around the champions on either side. So now we have this stalemate, and it's all about who can sort of sneakily progress their game plan. And the edge, this is where the edge goes to the Ezreal Karma deck, I think, because just by passing turns, we're getting closer to that leveled Karma.
Yeah, I think the Deep Meditation is probably what you want to be doing this turn. Actually going to hold it back, perhaps not wanting to commit that much mana, maybe deciding that he is late enough in the game where he can wait until he has a leveled Karma out and actually get 4 spells out of his deck. But so far, Italian X, do we see this 3rd Concussive Palm onto the Solitary Monk?
We do, looks like.
All right, so yeah, Topher saying, you haven't played Vi at this point, I'm going to play to what is available, and we even see it deny. I feel like this has been definitely substandard for how this matchup typically plays out. We don't see this much fighting over a Solitary Monk. We're seeing the 3rd Concussive Palm come out onto it. We're now seeing a deny even to defend it. Italian X is very determined to actually push through this 4 damage finally, and Topher can just kill this with a Get Excited if he really wants to.
I don't think Topher cares at all, really. We're close enough to the Karma. You've got the healing potion in hand, which is going to represent, of course, 6 life once you do hit 10 and get that leveled Karma into play. And it's so late at this point, what burst is Italian X going to run out, right? You are only scared about the tempo turns with Heimerdinger. You only respect a lot of the cards in this deck in combination with one of the champions. And so I actually quite like how Topher's playing it. The game may not be particularly exciting, but I think the pressure is on Italian X to do something. And I wonder, because Italian X's single loss for the day was in the final round to Croc AI, who does play Karma Ezreal. So I don't know whether this is an adaptation, this sort of strange approach to the matchup is an adaptation to that one loss that Italian X took, or whether this is why Italian X lost.
Yeah, and I definitely see what you mean about Italian X feeling the pressure. It's not often that we see denies come out on concussive palms, especially when that is sort of one of your catch-all removal spells not removal spell. It's like a removal spell for a removal spell. Something comes out at your Heimer, you deny it. But Italian X deciding that he really needs this monk to stick through, and I think, we are seeing a little bit of desperation, not wanting this monk to get stalled out for the third turn in a row, needs to be pressuring the life total of Topher, who himself is still pretty far off of this Ezreal level, and so far neither player has really had a great time at playing towards their sort of typical game plan. Italian X not having any of the champions available to him. Topher does have the Karma, but wants to save it for turn 10 at this point, and I'm not sure who's really favored here. I think Italian X could blow things wide open if he can play patiently until he finds the Heimerdinger, because I would assume that with this much inactivity, he's got some number of Flash of Brilliance up his sleeve.
Yeah, that seems a lot like it, right? Like the fact that Italian X was willing to spend a deny to not only defend the monk, but prevent, because the big thing about the palm is that it creates a unit. It's a tempo play that would have put Italian X back in the back seat of this board state. Actually, now both players seem to draw units and actually contribute something to the board. But I feel like Italian X's hand is just clogged with, spells. And like you said, Flash of Brilliance, spells that you really don't want to cast until you find that Heimerdinger. So Italian X is just desperately trying to preserve this kind of neutral, slow-paced board state rather than let Topher, crank up the pressure, because then Italian X will be forced to waste resources from hand before they're really netting full value.
Yeah, and next turn is where we kind of see the floodgates open for Topher potentially. Will have that leveled up Karma, can get down a slew of powerful spells in hand, does have, this Static Shock, this Get Excited, this Mystic Shot, and could actually just go for lethal onto Italian X with the upgraded Karma, trying to math out exactly how much damage he's going to have available. He can play the Mystic Shot and the Get Excited in the same turn, put his opponent down to 1, and as we had mentioned, there's not a lot of proactive healing in Italian X's deck. It really is just that Spirit's Refuge. He needs a unit to connect in order to get his life total higher, so that Static Shock could come out and finish the game on the following turn, even if the Karma is no longer there to back it up. Of course, hovering that shuffling a bunch of mushrooms into your opponent's deck is another possible option. You put them down to 1, they find 1 damage off the top, and the game just ends immediately.
Obviously, the mushrooms adding the extra damage and sort of unpredictable damage is nice as well. We talked a lot about when players are so good, the idea of utilizing any uncertain factor, any variable factor to try and throw off their read of the lines of play is very valuable. But is there a reason not to just go for the lethal when it presents itself? And now that Ezreal is available as well to Topher, surely you go for it here, because if Topher has made the same read we have, that Italian X is like hand-loaded, bases loaded, and we're waiting for Heimerdinger to bring it home, you surely want to end the game before that happens. You don't want to have to contest with the Heimerdinger messing up your plans.
Yeah, I think he needs to get the Shrooms into deck first. Here we even see the Static Shock fired off, not going into the face at all either, which does mean that Topher is still committed all in on this Ezreal game plan. Since the Static Shock isn't actually softening up this Claws of the Dragon in any meaningful way, he could have very well thrown that extra damage at face, and now we are going to see Topher, or Italian X rather, getting this Spirit's Refuge down onto the Solitary Monk, and with this healing coming out, I think the burn plan is off the table for Topher, which is fine because he's already committed to the Ezreal's portion of things to finish off this game.
Yeah, that was a really interesting Static Shock to line up on both units when one is already going to trade. Like, it's clearly in anticipation of the Spirit's Refuge, but it has to be in anticipation of the double Refuge, because as we're just about to see, just pinging the Monk doesn't ensure the trade if the Refuge goes on that unit. And if you aren't getting a Refuge onto the Claws, then the ping wasn't necessary to enforce that trade. So we're losing a little bit of value off the spell here, and as you just mentioned, every bit of value counts. If you're expecting that play, maybe just don't attack.
Yeah, no, I think it was thrown onto both units to tick up the Ezreal, as that is something that Topher does have in hand. He has that win condition available to him. He's still a couple of targets off, so just throwing it onto the unit instead of the face so that he can get that Ezreal a little bit closer to the Evolution, who I think is sitting at 5 out of 8. And Topher, of course, now has the option to, if he's not going to go for the burn plan, which is now sort of offline because he did throw that Static Shock at the unit instead of face, the Spirit's Refuge did come out. I think this Mystic Shot is pretty likely to finish off the Solitary Monk, and then, I think that puts us pretty close to the Ezreal Evolution, but he's got to find time to get down Karma or Ezreal in pretty safe manners, and I think that Chump Wump is, not a out of the question play here. Fire off one of those Shrooms, get these deep meditations down to 3 mana on the following turn.
Yeah, and of course, you even have the second mushroom lying around afterwards. You can either discard it to get excited, or it's a very cheap Ezreal trigger if we are now on that plan. And I suppose, now that you pointed it out, I do like it. I suppose it's if Topher is looking for ways to level Ezreal well as much as possible, saving those spells that can go face for more damage, because you're certain that Italian X probably has more copies of Spirit's Refuge in hand. There has to be a lot of unusable spells So you may have to kill your opponent from 20 life. You really need to make sure you're maxing your OTK potential.
Yeah, and it looks like Topher, at 10 cards in hand, is definitely going to fire off at least one of these mushrooms. Might fire both of them off, but it's really up to Italian X. Going to tap out for the Thermogenic Beam. And Thermogenic Beam is a card that can be a little bit awkward to play in a matchup like this, but Italian X finally finding the time to do it, as Topher doesn't have Karma mana available now, thanks to those nerfs from a couple of patches ago. Ezreal only sitting at 5 out of 8 isn't going to be super impactful to get thrown down, and Italian X finding that one very narrow window where he can actually find value with this beam.
Yeah, it is pretty important, although I am interested. These Karma Ezreal decks are really skimping on the copies of Deny. Do you think that comes back to haunt you in a matchup like this? Because we talked about its main role in such champion-focused decks. Its main role is as a prevention of a removal spell. But while the Heimerdinger deck, goes very hard on Twin Disciplines and denies it can get the extra turret value out of playing them, even if eventually your opponent does spend more cards to get the kill, your certain lines with the Ezreal Karma combo can leave windows for those champions to die, and against a deck with so much removal, something like a Thermogenic Beam, you'd love to be able to block.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit weird and polarizing, especially because we do, as far as I saw, I think we've constantly seen 3 copies of Deny coming out of these Heimer Vi decks, than the Karma Ezreal, as you said, only running 1. I think it just kind of speaks more towards the anti-aggro mindset that the Karma Ezreal players are coming out with. Deny typically doesn't get a lot of value in those matchups unless you are specifically against Harrowing Darius, in which case you can deny the Harrowing. It's really only the mana, it's really like that is the only mana efficient hit in the matchup. Of course, you can hit Decimate and Noxian Fervor, things of that nature, but for the most part there's so many burst speed spells and uninteractable instances in a lot of matchups that I do think the Deny doesn't play as well in the Karma Ezreal, because you're not getting any additional value out of it. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to be playing Denies once you have the leveled up Ezreal out. That is something that, typically you're just playing that and then immediately firing off all of your hand, whereas in the Heimer Vi deck you do get that 4 mana turret out of it.
Yeah, I mean, you make some great points. It's possible that, since it does seem like the Harrowing Darius deck's playing 3 Harrowings as their late game insurance if their board dies, it seems to be the dominant aggro deck by a long way. Maybe that you could make the argument to slip in more Denies, but obviously you have to make your decisions. And yeah, when you're playing a deck as slow as this, that you're trying to get to turn 10, having cards that, as you mentioned, are kind of bricks very often against the aggressive decks is not where you want to be. So it's understandable, but something that may cost him in this matchup, depending. Like, you can't even deny your opponent's Deny to force through, a relevant removal spell on a Heimerdinger. If you've only got, say, 1 card in hand that can kill it, like this Get Excited, you might be in some trouble, because it only really takes 1 turn of Italian X with this much mana casting spells, and we can assume multiple Flash of Brilliance to present a really troubling board to Topher.
Yeah, and now both players this is another sort of awkward turning point in the matchup where both players are a little bit more lax on mana than they have been for the rest of the game. We're finally down to 10 mana instead of 13, and this is sort of a turn where proactive plays are easier to punish, but also sort of the turn where you can get your opponent to tap out a little more reactively and then go for your proactive plays, although it looks like we're not going to see anything too fancy coming out of either of these players.
Yeah, again, just playing really conservatively. I can't blame either of them. Obviously, this is the game that Topher wants to play, and it's kind of the game that Italian X needs to play. We even see those mushrooms kicking in, providing some role in the matchup, helping to the burn count. And how low does Italian X need to be before Topher can maybe just act rashly, pull the trigger?
10.
Okay.
10 is where he dies to the Get Excited Mystic Shot with the Karma. If he can pick up another Mystic Shot, perhaps off this Deep Meditation, then he can kind of go for that. But yeah, so far, as soon as he finds another burn spell, then he's in a good position, as long as it is something that, I think it has to specifically be Mystic Shot, because that is the only other card that he can play in the same turn as the Karma, and because Spirit's Refuge is the only amount of healing coming out, because, Italian X is low enough to the point where a single Deny isn't going to save him. I think as soon as he can find that second copy of Mystic Shot, then he's going to be in a great position, and with 2 Deep Meditation in hand, I think, he's going to have a great chance at actually finding that very soon.
Yeah, the Static Shock from Topher, there's something that I was wondering whether he would go for there, also has the Will of Ionia in hand, which of course is not only, that's going to be now the last target after firing off that Static Shock to level up Ezreal, who presents a more mana efficient out in terms of burning out Italian X, and now by making the last card that you're casting to level it up, the Will of Ionia, it can effectively answer any champion or aggressive play that Italian X goes for, while preserving all of your burn spells in hand to maximize that kill potential. We are going to go for the shot, though, it looks like, just for mana reasons.
Yeah, it looks like Topher is going to just, play to the Ezreal win condition, I think it would have been okay for him to just, Will of Ionia this, as you said, run out the Ezreal, play all of your burst spells in response to it dying, and then on the following turn, throw out the Karma and throw out the burn spells that you have in response, all on the same turn. But Italian X actually going to protect the Solitary Monk, and with no Vi or Heimer in hand, this Solitary Monk does have potential to take over games. This is not typically a matchup where we see that happen, but this is, a fair amount of resources that he's committed to keeping the monks alive at this point. We've seen Spirit's Refuge, Deny, even this Twin Disciplines, and Italian X, you feel like if he found a Heimer at this point, we'd be in a totally different game, but I have to give it to Topher on this one, as he does have the leveled up Ezreal and has a fair amount of burst spells and refuel in his hand.
Yeah, I mean, Italian X clearly doing the best that they can, because it does seem like maybe there's just been a complete brick from that deck, which, I mean, we've seen throughout the weekend. If you play a deck that's so focused on, really one champion, there's just no guarantee that you will draw it. These decks don't even play the rummage or anything else to help you dig, so normally you might have time with all this removal, but you only have so much time against Karma Ezreal, and we are definitely seeing where the Karma Ezreal deck takes its edge from in the matchup, because Topher was completely happy with the really casual pace of this game, and it's taken a little while, but now he is in a commanding position, looking to close things out this turn.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything that Italian X can do at this point. He did let Topher sort of untap with that Ezreal, and now with the Karma out, I think he has enough burst spells to just kill his opponent between, the Mushroom Cloud, the Health Potion, that represents about 3 damage. Then we're going to see this double up get excited with the Ezreals on board. There's really nothing that Italian X is going to be able to do about this, and that is sort of what we were talking about earlier. The consistency is the defining factor of this Karma Ezreal deck. Italian X unable to find any copies of the Heimer or the Vi, and it's just completely lacking in a win condition once that happens.
Yeah, this is the difference between a control combo deck and a tempo deck. Like the Weimar deck is everyone's choice, is the most popular deck in this top 16 and in the tournament more broadly, because its god draws are really kind of the strongest draws around. But if you brick on it, right, like the inevitability, this combo deck is so much better at waiting, and the power of that game plan only gets better the longer you give the deck. Whereas the Weimar deck, even once you cap out on mana, there's a point where like you can only jam so many denies and so many spells on the same turn as your Heimerdinger to get value. There's only so much of a chance, that you can actually get in with Vi once your opponent, has available all of their answers. Whereas, like, you just saw there were no answers to that combo. You're just dead.
Yeah, the infinite value engine of the Heimerdinger is great and all, but if your hand is just full of gas and you don't have a card to put it in, you're not going anywhere.
That's a great analogy. I'm not sure that Italian X would be super thrilled to hear it, but it describes the matchup very well as we move into the next game.
Yeah, and this is a matchup that I'm kind of curious about. We had mentioned that the Heimer Vise are typically pulling out, full stop, all 3 copies of Deny. Let me just pop in on the deck list here. Only 2 Denies in the deck, but, as long as you can line those up onto the War Mother's Calls, things are a little bit awkward for Topher. The typical reason that we don't see War Mother's Call come out anywhere near as often as any other Shadow Isle deck on ladder is because it is particularly weak to Ionia. You're playing all these massive expensive units. You need to get a War Mother's Call down. If that lines up with a Deny, all of a sudden you have to spend the mana for your units, and those just get lined up with Will of Ionias, and things turn disastrously for you. But Topher does have a fair amount of rather efficient removal for this Heimerdinger. It's a little bit awkward to kill it on turn 5, and I think if it can live through that, then he's going to have smooth sailing. It would really take like 2 copies of the box in order for Topher to be able to get that one actually done through a Twin Disciplines.
And it's interesting, I think Topher has the same idea, right? Because you're mulliganing everything except the box and your Accelerant. So you're trying to find more of this cheap, ultra-efficient removal that's just the one spell in your deck to line up against Italian X's best draws. You mentioned before, this deck choice from Topher, it is very slanted. It has a narrow range of matchups, and I'd argue this is pretty much outside it. This deck must suffer against Karma Ezreal. I can only imagine you die. I guess they play less Denies. That's your one out that you might actually be more likely to resolve a War Mother's Call. But if they find their copy of Deny, or if they play a second copy, like that inevitability is the counter to a deck that's as slow and as sort of focused on one available win condition as this War Mother's Call deck. There's a little bit more room for Topher to get in the win in this one, because you're not as vulnerable to the late game. Maybe you just kill every champion in Italian X's deck. That is still a pretty blue sky kind of hope. Things have to line up very well for you. And I mean, this Weimar deck is not the best deck in the meta for nothing.
Yeah, I think he's actually going to have a rougher time against things like the Karma, or I think he's actually got a little bit of a better chance against things like the Karma Ezreal, just because you're not playing any units. By the time you are starting to throw things down, your opponent is still going to be at 0 out of 8 Ezreal targets, and then once the War Mother's Call train gets going, you're putting down 2 high health units too quickly for your opponent to have the mana to line up to consistently answer them. And I do kind of like this Fading Memories going down on the Shadow Assassin, finding himself a draw. It presents a pretty good block for the turn. The Avalanche now picked up to even take out these units. And interesting to see him going for the block onto the Shadow Assassin rather than the Claw of the Dragon, just because, you know, the Avalanche is going to clean both of these up, but you're not really blocking units. You're typically killing them with removal spells. So I think you'd rather just get rid of the high attack one rather than the elusive one.
I mean, it can only speak to the idea that Topher is not happy committing the Avalanche at this stage. He's going to hold on to that spell and maybe hold it to combine with something else later, or just wants to bank the spell mana and maybe have the Vengeance available, because we are going into turn 5, so Heimerdinger could come out, and there's no Deny available yet, so by having this Vengeance, you essentially guarantee a kill if AWanderingBard does decide to go for that. I mean, I'm sure AWanderingBard understands the risk and goes for the slightly sort of lower risk, lower reward play. Will you commit a Vengeance to kill a Vi?
This is why I've always loved Karma Heimerdinger and Vi Heimerdinger, is because having this backup champion on the Heimerdinger turn that demands an answer, you know, just getting this Vengeance out of Topher's hand does mean that the Heimerdinger is going to be a little bit safer to come down later on. And you don't really care if the Vi dies in this matchup. She's not going to get a lot done. There aren't really units for her to pick on. She can push through a fair amount of damage, but overall you're going to be more than happy to get a Vengeance out of your opponent's hand onto a card not named Heimerdinger.
Yeah, it's strange to think that the reason you put a card in the deck, like the fantasy you have when you add those Vi's, is that I'll cast this and it'll get immediately removed. But that really seems to be the card's strongest position, is against these Freljord Shadow Isles decks. They basically have to Vengeance her every time. And now the Heimerdinger lands, so do you have another Vengeance? Topher does play 3, and it turns out there is one in the hand, but you can see how AWanderingBard is trying to stretch the removal suite. And now there is Deny mana.
Yeah, that's sort of the beautiful part of it, is even with the Deny nerf coming up to 4 mana, you know, you just curve into the Heimerdinger on the following turn, and Topher's got a couple of tough decisions to make. He didn't find sort of something to pair with that box, like a Grasp of the Undying, that can actually kill this Heimerdinger if there is a Deny or a Will of Ionia. I think he's probably more likely to go for... You know, I think he's going to start off with this Avalanche. That only leaves him with 4 mana, but the box does have the strength of, even if it doesn't kill the Heimerdinger, it will at least kill all of the turrets that come down on the same turn as it, you know, with these Flash of Brilliances coming out. And, you know, stringing together the Avalanche and the Vile Feast definitely makes the Deny a lot more awkward for AWanderingBard.
Yeah, and it even leaves Topher with exactly 5 mana. So in this scenario, if AWanderingBard really goes for it hard, maybe has multiple Flash of Brilliances, we see the first one come out now. If Topher feels pressured and AWanderingBard overcommits, there is even the Withering Wail, which after this Avalanche would also mop up the Heimerdinger. I mean, it's a bit of a Christmas Land scenario, but you are leaving your options as open as possible. So Topher really playing to the outs, even though, you know, you mentioned the draw is kind of awkward.
Yeah, AWanderingBard is going to have a really hard time keeping this Heimer alive into the hand of Topher. You know, it might not necessarily die this turn, but the amount of value that it's going to get before it does die is pretty questionable. We've already seen 1 Flash of Brilliance thrown out. Now AWanderingBard is going to let this Avalanche resolve, and that does put the Heimerdinger down to 1 HP. There are a couple of things that he can have to let it live through this turn, but it really comes down to what can the Heimerdinger accomplish on the turn that it actually ends up dying.
Yeah, and now we see the obvious like bluff of Deny or hold up of Deny from AWanderingBard. Going to see whether Topher actually commits something. Do you try the... Oh, we're going to try the box. Okay. I was going to say, do you maybe try and force a Deny out on the Vile Feast first, the sort of lower value spell, but higher risk, higher reward play being put on the stack?
Yeah, it's a little bit awkward because if you throw out the Vile Feast and that gets denied, then the box is off the table as an answer. As the Heimerdinger only entered the field this turn, it won't be able to sort of hit that again. It'll be able to take out turrets in the future, but we do get the Deny out, and I think that Topher is kind of happy to see that. One of the things about the War Mother's control deck is that you are so overloaded on things that your opponent has to deny that, you know, while getting denied does feel bad, it does pave the way for you to play some higher impact spells a little bit later on. You know, we do still have the Vengeance in hand. We haven't seen a War Mother's Call come out just yet, but it is going to be harder to stop once he actually does find it. And he's currently pretty well poised to just clean up this board with a Withering Wail or an Anivia attack.
Yeah, exactly. By getting the box denied there, I mean, he took a little bit of damage, but this deck does play every available source of healing just about, and, you know, you're much more concerned about preserving your long-term game plan. Getting out of Deny is almost like, you know, that's one of two. So now you're sort of 50% closer to winning the game with War Mother's Call, if you want to look at it like that. So, as long as Topher doesn't get surprised here, as long as there's not like a supply of saves for this Heimerdinger, Twin Disciplines would be pretty rough now that you're relying on one damage spells like Withering Wail and the Vile Feast in order to get the job done. But if this resolves, Topher is a happy man.
Yeah, this Vile Feast is actually probably the strongest opener that Topher can have, just kind of poking at Italian X, seeing what they want to commit, and with the Twin Discipline coming down, this does tell you that the Anivia wouldn't have worked out, and now you have the mana to commit to either Grasp of the Undying or Vengeance if you really do want to take this Heimerdinger out, and I would think that the Grasp is going to come out again, kind of poke at the Heimer one more time, see if another Twin Discipline comes out, because he does still have that Withering Wail to clean up the rest of the board after, all this said and done on the following turn. Italian X goes to the open attack, and you can kill the Heimer a little bit later, as long as you can clean up the turrets in the meantime, keep yourself at that healthy life total. I don't think you're going to be too mad at the outcome.
Yeah, committing to the Vengeance, if that gets denied, like, you are really risking a blowout there. You're left with no mana, no spell mana to bank for next turn. These two remaining answers in your hand have 5 mana, so they're starting to get pretty expensive. And as you mentioned, it's a really interesting and well sort of marshaled plan by Topher that obviously with a deck with all of this removal, you might be tempted to just sort of like chuck things out. Like, I've got so many answers, I'm just going to play whatever. But by sequencing things this way, he's constantly trying to play the mana efficiency game and make sure that the maximum number of answers in his hand are still turned on. As you mentioned last turn, playing the box was just a concession to the fact that that card was going to sort of fade out of being as relevant to the board state, and by preserving all of these options, you're really taxing again the defensive cards, even from this Heimerdinger deck, which plays probably the most of them.
Yeah, things can get a little bit awkward for Topher here, though. If this Heimerdinger does actually level up on this turn, then even if you do manage to take this one out, you're already down 2 Vengeances, you do still have all of your Ruinations, but you're at a point where, Grasp of the Undyings and boxes no longer line up onto the Heimerdinger, and that can get a little bit awkward, and I think that's why we see the Vengeance committed here over the Grasp of the Undying.
Yeah, exactly. Especially knowing that like the Vengeance is answered only by the Deny, but the Grasp of the Undying, there could be another Twin Disciplines, there could be a Spirit's Refuge, which again there's 3 of in this deck. There's a lot of answers to damage-based removal, a phrase that keeps coming up in this meta, and so you're just going to make sure, get excited happening.
This could be big for Italian X. If he has the Deny and is hanging on to that for a Withering Wail as opposed to protecting the Heimerdinger, we could see a very surprise lethal coming out of Italian X, which would actually propel him into the top 4. So if he does have that Deny in hand, I think this is a super heads-up play, understanding that Topher doesn't have the mana for 2 copies of the card, and this is sort of your one window to win.
Yeah, and we see the box being drawn again, that limitation of the box. We've talked about how it shouldn't really prevent you playing the card, but it sure hurts you to draw it here, not immediately relevant, and you have to just hope that Italian X does not have the second Deny, only plays 2. You'd be sweating, you'd feel pretty unlucky if they had it, but sometimes these things happen.
I feel like it would have been a snap Deny, but I'm guessing at this point he doesn't have it. There's no reason to make him sweat. You either have it or you don't, and that does mean that Italian X is going to be in a bit of a rough position.
Yeah, okay. Good job, Italian X. I mean, very rough position to be in, but at least you're not a slow roller. No one likes those players.
Oh, and actually doing nothing else with the remainder of the turn, Topher going to be able to get into this, full suite of mana, and now can start just slamming down some of his larger units. The Anivia is leveled, the Tryndamere just represents 8 damage.
That makes me really wonder what the rest of the hand is, right? Like, maybe it's defensive spells like Will of Ionia, but even cards like Twin Disciplines or Spirit's Refuge, like, surely there's some argument to playing them on your turrets to preserve them. If there was another copy of a Heimerdinger or something, you'd probably run it out. So are we just holding everything and hoping for the top deck of a second Heimer?
It's possible. It's definitely a little bit weird to me to, kind of think that he doesn't have a Vi or a second Heimer on backup, no Shadow Assassins or Chump Wumps. Like, there are a lot of cards that he could have played here. And granted, there are quite a few bricks in the Heimer Vi deck. I do think that a defensive spell like the Twin Discipline or the Spirit's Refuge would have had a lot of value coming out to push through that little bit of extra damage. But maybe just understanding... Oh. Sorry, my cat tried to jump on my desk, but, didn't quite make it and started falling.
Okay, so we see that, at least one of those defensive spells that would have been difficult to use in that situation, we're going to recall the Anivia, but I think Topher's pretty happy to see that usage of mana and cards.
Yeah, and Italian X floating another turn that, the Will of Ionia is good against these high mana units, but only if you can take advantage of the remainder of the turn. If you just take a -1 to Will of Ionia and sort of prevent this Anivia from dealing 5 damage to you, it's just going to come down on the following turn, but he does find the Heimerdinger.
Okay, well, now we'll see what the rest of Italian X's hand was. This is potentially the payoff that they were playing towards, and so that tempo from the recall, suddenly very valuable, buying you this time. How many defensive spells are there?
Yeah, this is where things get a little bit scary. Even if you throw out defensive spell after defensive spell and kind of run out your entire hand getting the turrets out, Topher does still have the box and will be able to clean up both the Heimerdinger and any amount of turrets coming down with it this turn.
Well, I suppose there is only just the box, right? You got Topher, if this gets defended and Topher is concerned about turrets, Topher has to hold the box and just let the turrets run. Because there's no mana for Grasp plus box, at least this turn.
Yeah, at least not a second Grasp, but we do see, first the Twin Disciplines comes out, going to protect that Heimer. And perhaps he had this on the attack turn and just decided that, the one turret wasn't realistically going to win him the game, even if it did push through a little bit of damage. He just kind of had to hang on to the defensive spells, hoping to draw another Heimerdinger. And now we are going to see the box committed. And Italian X, if they have something like a Spirit's Refuge here, they could be back in this game in a pretty big way.
I'm not trying to predict doom for Topher, but it's sort of just trying to read the hands. That feels like it's probably what Italian X has, because it's the only thing that explains those two past turns. It really feels like a strong gamble banking that these defensive cards, when they get their biggest payoff on Heimerdinger, and you need a big payoff to go through all of the removal and defensive power of this Freljord deck. Just protecting one turret was never going to get the job done with all these grasps in hand. So if Italian X was, saving up those cards for a rainy day, it's starting to pour. This is the time.
Yeah, and Italian X seems to be agonizing over whatever kind of decision they have to make.
Ooh.
Oh, is going to be another Get Excited fit. This feels a little bit risky. This is the second time that he's discarded a card to try and push through a little bit of damage. This is why we saw him hold back the defensive spells on all the turrets. This doesn't feel like a play that's going to win you the game. And now that he's down 2 Heimerdingers, and only with 2 cards left in hand, I do think his days are numbered. I can't imagine a string of top decks that actually let him come back into this in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'm struggling to... I can only assume the cards in hand are like Thermo Beam, right? Like just something that's stone unplayable in terms of progressing your own game plan, and that Topher hasn't really exposed any targets to just yet. Yeah, Will of Ionia and Thermo Beam are kind of bricks for Italian X at this point, because he is so forced into an aggressive posture by this overwhelming late game and controlling presence of the War Mother's deck. And so the fact that there was only one defensive card to run out to save that Heimerdinger, but he still felt pressured to play the Heimerdinger with one card backing it up, kind of shows you the pressure that he's under.
Yeah, and again, we're going to see the Will of Ionia stalling out the Sinivia, and this just feels so unimpactful. Italian X, is going to preserve the turret, but we do see Topher with the 2 Grasp of the Undyings. I actually would be a little surprised not to see him just kind of fire one of these off here to be a little bit mana efficient. The Ledros was available as an answer for Topher to the Will of Ionia. It is a card that gets immediate value, so even if it gets willed, you're not feeling as bad about it. But yeah, just going to clean up the board. Italian X down to 2 cards, and Topher, I'm feeling pretty confident about his chances to move on to the top 4.
Yeah, it just seems like Topher as well. This is the play of a confident player, right? You mentioned you could have committed the Ledros, but, why be mana efficient? Like, be able to play your removal spell this turn if you want. Just leave all your options open. You know that 2 Heimerdingers are down, but maybe there's a third coming off the top. And at this point, that Topher really is in the spot that he wants to be. It hasn't resolved a War Mother's Call at any point, but as long as you can answer, these threats like this Monk, you are going to coast to victory in the next couple of turns. Even these wills, which have kind of hampered Italian X so much, are being forced out of hand, so even they will not get real value now. It just hasn't lined up very well for the Weimar deck.
Yeah, and this Grasp of the Undying onto the Solitary Monk should be sort of the final nail in the coffin. You are going to have that elusive turret still available, but, that's not enough damage to be pushed through. It's unrealistic for that to win you the game through the amount of cards in Topher's hand, especially because of the way that the turn system lines up in Legends of Runeterra. Topher's going to be able to drop these massive bombs on both your turn and his turn, and he could actually just have lethal with the Tryndamere spell in hand, that Battle Rage giving his Tryndamere +8/+4. But I do think Topher's kind of got, his options available to him here. I think just based on the mana that he has, I think we're going to see the Anivia run back out just to keep this Grasp of the Undying available just in case, and then we can see a bigger bomb played on the following turn when he's got the spell mana available to play Grasp alongside a Tryndamere.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. There's no reason to rush with a deck like this. If you commit to playing this deck, you do not need to, play risky at this point, at this late stage in the matchup when things are so heavily in your favor. And I mean, we've talked about this Heimer deck being a car. This is when the car runs out of gas, right? We saw that the gas was, it didn't flow very steadily, and unfortunately hasn't really gotten the car where it needs to go. And now looking at that hand, only 2 cards. This is not a spot that we see this deck win games from. You need to have things to back up, whatever unit you run out, be it Vi, be it Heimer, the Monk, even this turret feels so much better when you haven't spent these twin disciplines and these denies.
Yeah, Italian X's car is out of gas. It is broken down onto the side of the road, and it is a cold, cold night in the Freljord. And Tryndamere and Anivia are going to make sure that Italian X does not survive the night. The Frostbite will eventually overtake him, and there's really nothing he can have left available. 2 Will of Ionias are already gone, 1 Deny already in the tank, and of course, 2 Heimerdingers down. There's nothing I can think of that he's going to be able to draw, but, just sort of playing this one out, seeing if he can manage to find something. Without Karma in the deck, you don't even have that sort of surprise factor of throwing out all this burn last second.
Yeah, it really is a race that's thrown its course, and you see that Twin Disciplines, like, it's the difference between that Twin Disciplines 5 turns ago and the Twin Disciplines now is massive, whereas, like, the cards in this deck or in the Karma Ezreal deck sort of retain their value over time. This really is about what combos of cards you can string together. And the Shadow Assassin, these are just the kind of cards that Italian X was missing in the mid game, and notably haven't really seen the deep meditations either, right? Like the things that keep you fueled up. It's just been a very awkward draw and a very unusual matchup. You have some dead draws, and I mean, Topher's tech choice of playing War Mother's Call Control, even more so than playing the Bald Eagle deck, is just looking better and better and better.
Yeah, and there we actually see the namesake War Mother's Call off the top, but with all this healing in hand, firing off the Catalyst of Aeons just to be mana efficient does mean that even if these attacks go through, which I'm not necessarily sure that they are, it still puts Topher at 9 life, and with 2 Get Exciteds already out of the deck, we did see those thrown at the face to develop those last second turrets before the Heimerdingers died. It does mean that Italian X has even less burn available to him, and this Vi feels like a nothing play. It's going to be able to clean up the Spider, but Topher actually fires off to get an elusive blocker as well as draw a card, and that Anivia's Harsh Winds is definitely going to be the final nail in the coffin if things were not already dead for Italian X's hopes here.
Yeah, poor Italian X just being pressured too much eventually. Italian X did the best job possible of trying to preserve those cards. We saw this very passive gameplay, several turns of just outright passing, so it's not one of these players who feels pressured into weak plays, weak turns that cost them potential later on. But eventually you have to do something because this late game has finally arrived. It took a while, but here's Anivia, here's Tryndamere, the War Mother's Call is back up in hand, the Ledros in hand. You aren't beating these units in the long run, and it's just unfortunate that by the time Italian X has finally drawn, another Vi, some sort of actually credible threat, there is no longer anything to support it, and the board on the other side is just insurmountable.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything that Italian X can do to sort of stall this one out any longer. Will almost certainly die on the following turn thanks to this Tryndamere's Battle Rage, as well as if anything goes unblocked, then, we do have that Spider representing lethal with the Anivia, but Topher does actually have to fire off the Grasp of the Undying here if he wants to win on the next turn. Assuming, some sort of answer onto this Tryndamere, maybe thinking that the Overwhelm is just going to be enough to kind of push through that lethal. It would take, the last Will of Ionia out of Italian X to hang on for just one more turn. And even then, I don't think Topher really cares that, the game has gone on another turn. He is still, in a position where he cannot lose more or less.
Yeah, I appreciate that Topher is still like, I mean, yeah, this is as close to a one game as you can possibly be. There really are, like, mathematically very few things that Italian X could even have to threaten victory. But Topher is still taking the time, and this is the kind of, like, fastidious play that you need to have in these sorts of decks because you are so slow to build your own game plan that your opponent probably will draw almost every card in their deck. You need to make sure that you're accounting for every possibility, and it looks like Topher's, all of that thought and effort and planning is finally about to pay off as we launch the final attack, put him into top 4.
Yeah, and this is an impossible board state to come through yet. Italian X actually just going to even pass this one over without any blocks, and that does mean Topher, bringing it back is going to be able to move into that top 4 with this pretty interesting lineup. Definitely the only War Mother's Call in the top 16, and maybe even the only War Mother's Call in the tournament.
I would not be surprised in the least. It takes with the amount of buzz around the Bald Eagle deck, and to be fair, the deck looks strong. Picked by many top players, definitely not just a curiosity. People are legitimately onto that as the sort of the answer to the meta, and then even worked on developing answers to that deck. So to go back and say, no, actually, I'll play this sort of traditional War Mother's Call style that's really out of fashion at the moment, that is a very singular call. I thought it might have just been Topher, taking a shot if he hadn't put a lot of reps into the Bald Eagle deck and didn't feel comfortable, or maybe, just personally had been enjoying this deck on ladder. But more and more, it actually looks like it might be like the skeleton key that unlocks this whole tournament. Like, what beats this deck that people are playing?
Yeah, it's kind of an adaptation of the Bald Eagle deck. Any of these late game Anivia decks feel like they're pretty favored against the Ionia Piltover Zon. So just kind of taking that in a little bit of a different direction, deciding that, Commander Ledros is still just one of the most powerful cards in all of Legends of Runeterra. This is a win condition that I can just run out and feel really good about. It is the most inevitable late game. It doesn't matter how many times you answer it. Unless you can obliterate this unit, it is going to consistently keep coming down.
Yeah, and it feels like a huge departure. Not that you're wrong, like everyone understands the power of Ledros at this point, but the fact that the Bald Eagle deck is predicated on its late game win condition and the inevitability, the power of multiple Anivias. As you mentioned, anytime you cast that Harrowing, you reanimate 4 Anivias, the magic number, it completely wears down the opposing board. It kind of feels like it trapped everyone in this like thought experiment of, well, what do I beat with that many Anivias? I can only do my own spread of Anivias or my own giant Harrowing attack with Overwhelm or go under it somehow. But by settling back to War Mother's Call and just playing a ton of sweepers and removal, Topher is kind of arguing that actually isn't as strong an endgame plan as people seem to have gotten caught up in thinking it is. And I mean, the top 16 results are kind of light on Bald Eagle decks at all, which does support that.
Yeah, that is definitely a little bit surprising, and it looks like Casanova will be hopping over to the Topher match, which means we're going to be hopping over to that other side of the bracket. We are going to have 4LW, Team IQ's very own, going to be getting into their game versus... I actually can't find the bracket on Smash GG. It says top 16 hasn't started yet, so I'm kind of like taking a look at the initial top 16 bracket, trying to puzzle out who's playing who, but I can at least pull up 4LW's deck list and see what we are working with here.
Yeah, 4LW is playing the Brom Swain deck, which I'm very glad we do get to commentate one of because it's my favorite deck coming out of this tournament. I went away and ran out a bunch of matches on ladder after the cast finish yesterday, just to see how good Leviathan Swain feels pretty good. And Easy Karma to back that up, a very stock list. So not the most experimental person. Is one of the Scouts players still in the tournament? I would hope so, because we didn't really get to see the power of that deck, and Aggro I feel like was just totally underrated going into the day.
Let me check. So he is playing against Kelvin Hawk,
which is going to be Ezreal TF and Brom Swain.
Okay, so yeah, I think at that point all of the Scout players have been eliminated unless Croc AI.
Wow.
So the four players left. Let me just get this one out there. It's Croc AI versus Topher on one side of the bracket, and then 4LW versus Kelvin Hawk on the other side. So let me just check Croc AI's deck, see if he was one of the Scout players.
On Bald Eagle and Ezreal Karma, one of the 2 players I think who brought that predicted quote best deck lineup. So that means that despite dominating the 6-1 standings and converting at an overall significant rate, not only the 2 Scouts players who went 6-1 Stand and Execration appear to have both gone down. Croc AI just defeated Execration 2-1. The Darius players seem to have actually been filtered out as well. That deck was totally overrepresented, one of the most populous in the top 16, and especially in the sort of top bracket of players. And now, unfortunately, meeting bad matchups or maybe just slightly better draws than their opponents and falling at the feet of these control decks as we sort of originally predicted. Yeah,
and worth noting, while it's not for Karma Ezreal in the top 8 because, because Kelvin Hawk has brought this Ezreal Twisted Fate, there are 4 Ezreal decks in the top 4. That is what we are sort of left with. Heimer Vi has been completely eliminated from the tournament, and I actually don't think we see... Okay, we do see one repeat on sort of the secondary deck for the players. We are going to get that Brom Swain mirror here out of these players, and actually, if I'm looking at this correctly... Yeah, the Brom has
a very interesting Brom Swain.
The Brom Swain decks are exactly the same. Sorry, there is one difference. There is a second Avalanche in Kelvin's deck, and I'm trying to figure out what that actual difference is. The Fury of the North goes down. So it's 2 Avalanche and 2 Fury of the North versus 1 Avalanche and 3 Fury of the North.
Yeah, sorry. So actually, these are the 2 Brom Swain players who both cut Babbling Bjerg? Yeah, they are. So all of the other Brom Swain players, and there were 5 in the top 16 alone were playing Babbling Berg to draw Leviathan automatically and guarantee that very, very powerful sort of mid-late game of just chaining Leviathans and Swains, which is kind of like what we saw as the big draw of the deck. But these players have actually foregone that to play additional sweepers.
Yeah, so Babbling Bjerg is a card that I really like, especially in some of these decks where you have that singular target and you're like, okay, I get to grab this every single time. I was a big fan of it in especially like the Swain Sejuani decks. It's like, okay, I'm either getting Sejuani or I'm getting Leviathan, but even a little bit more streamlined here, only grabbing the Leviathan, and it is a little bit of a slower card. It doesn't play out super great into these aggro formats. It's not very... its stats aren't phenomenal at a 3-3. I think if it were a 3-4 and it could resist the overwhelm damage of some of these harrowing decks a little bit better, maybe it'd still be a consideration for players like this. But instead, we're seeing 3 copies of the Kindly Tavern Keeper, really giving respect over to these aggro decks, of which I believe all aggro decks have been eliminated from the tournament at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's no accident because... when I look at it, okay, so last round, Kelvin Hack overcame Oneric, who was the lone Sea Monsters player, disappointed to not get to actually see that deck played. And before that beat Bruised by God, actually, who was playing Braum, Swain, and Weimerdinger. So I was just trying to see if these players actually ran into the aggro decks and whether that adaptation of playing more healing, more AoE, less sort of greedy card advantage did pay off for them directly. It does look like they had a lot of 2-1s going, so it's really hard to say how the decks lined up. But, okay, so... 4LW did beat Stan, who was the Lucian Scouts Harrowing Darius player, 2-0. So that says something about that adaptation. And then overcame Omega Drax, who was leading for much of yesterday, who had that interesting Braum Swain / Ezreal TF lineup, just playing no top-tier decks and running the tables pretty well. Came to a stop there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I am actually just checking something really quick because I don't want to sound like a total fool here, but I am trying to find... I'm in the Duels of Runeterra channel trying to find the Hall of Fame. Here we are, because I do believe... Yeah, okay, so I was right. Stan won Duels of Runeterra 11 for Europe last weekend. Yes. So it is, he wasn't able to make the run back on those kinds of tournaments, was actually eliminated from this one in the top 8. But yeah, you can't win them all. It's really hard to run back-to-back tournaments, especially, across multiple formats, but it does speak to Stan's power level as a player, the fact that he was able to, go and win Duels of Runeterra in this unique format, then come into this new format, still get a top 8, and I know that he's topped tournaments in the past, so far, Stan really showing a great breadth as a player and having the adaptability to, come across in these multiple formats and still have the adaptations to make it pretty far.
I don't want to sound too paranoid, and there's more than one person with the name in the world, but with Stan from Europe being a top player in a card game, I have to ask if this is Stanislav Sivka.
I do know Stanislav Sivka. That would be wild.
I mean, he hasn't, as far as I've seen, said anything about Runeterra that I've noticed. But, if anyone was just going to come and, just randomly spike tournaments out of nowhere, I would give credit to him and that whole house of players. It's just one of the most... That's the brains trust of, or supervillain layer of card gamers on Earth right now.
Jam said Stan is not Sivka.
Okay, it's not Stan Sivka. Damn, I really would have loved if that was the case.
This conspiracy theory has no legs. This was shut down immediately.
Okay, all right. Jeez, don't let me have any fun. But credit, whichever Stan this is, credit to there. That is some really good records. Although, I gotta say, in terms of past results, it's also 4LW who's kind of on a bit of a run. Had top 32, it seems like, at Runeterra for change, and then top 16 in Duels 11. So, kind of improving, now in top 4, so that's already a step up, but imagine taking a few steps further and actually winning this whole thing.
Yeah, that would be actually crazy. We're seeing... so, with the players that we have left in Top Cut, I'm not sure how many of them have actually picked up a win in a tournament like this before. I don't know. I think Topher is the one... No, I think Croc AI actually won, a really early Duels of Runeterra, and I think Topher might have as well. I do... Okay, yeah, so Croc AI did win Duels of Runeterra number 4 for North America. I'm not seeing Topher with a Duels of Runeterra W next to his name, but it could be a JamFest victory that he had picked up previously.
But still, certainly not the most decorated player. So, we got a lot of hungry people in this top 4.
Uh-oh. Did the stream freeze for you as well, or is that just me?
Which stream?
4LW.
Oh, yeah, actually, huh?
Okay.
I looked away for a second. I'm just looking at starting hand.
I believe that Kelvin is streaming as well, so if we do have consistent issues, we can get you over to that. But it looks like things are okay. Things are not fixed.
Okay, yeah, I'm saying. Okay. It worked for like a second.
All right, let me see if I can pull up Kelvin's stream then.
Yeah.
Not a problem. This is sort of the advantage of having both sides of the ball game here. As soon as I can actually find him.
Okay, Kelvin is at the main menu, which implies that wasn't just the stream going down. That's like the whole internet for 4LW.
Gotcha.
From the game. Because they were in game a moment ago.
Yeah, this is a little bit awkward, but we'll be 4LW is actually #1 on ladder right now, getting a little bit of trivia fun facts here out of Remarkable Jam. Appreciate you keeping us honest with these facts about the players.
A few of the players have the same tag as 4LW, like #BR1. So I have to imagine they might be celebrating him. That's quite an achievement.
I'm just going to pull it back to us while we sort of let these players get into game and sort of figure out what we're dealing with here. I'll pull up 4LW's stream again, just in case, he does get back online and we can get into that view of things as well.
Do you want to do a little bit of a matchup breakdown before we launch? This is a top 4 match. It's worth the time.
Yeah, it's kind of an awkward thing to break down just because, they are running the exact same Braum Swain deck, sans that one card, and I do think the Fury of the North is going to actually... that extra copy of Fury of the North versus that extra copy of Avalanche is going to play a little bit better in that mirror. But one thing that we did talk a lot about yesterday was this Ezreal Twisted Fate versus this Karma Ezreal deck, where it kind of felt like the Ezreal Twisted Fate was advantaged in a matchup like that because you do just get to steal all of your opponent's impactful spells as well as go wide on the board with some of these more aggressive units. And the Riptide Rex, of course, absolutely rips through decks like the Karma Ezreal that don't maintain a board super well.
Yeah, it does feel like a really great adaptation where your opponent is playing the slow, inevitable Ezreal deck, but your Ezreal deck is much more flexible in pace. You don't have to, I guess we've talked about Karma's advantage being that you don't need to have her or even play her before turn 10. It's just once you get there, that your plan's online. But that also, you can't really accelerate that plan short of, going to Freljord for Catalyst. So by playing Ezreal TF, you are and playing a lot of weaker minions or followers that you can flood the board with, and like you said, put on pressure. You really create a much more flexible game plan, and you can go for tempo plays in this Ezreal deck, which is very powerful.
So it looks like 4LW is actually back online. Kelvin is still sitting in the main menu screen, so I don't know if there's just a significant delay on that stream, but we are going to get you guys into the game now.
Sure.
Just a little bit of weird technical difficulties, but we got it all figured out. We are still early in this game, and we are getting started off with the mirror match, of which we're pretty much seeing an exact mirror of cards coming out. The Arachnoid Sentries, both players having Ravenous Flocks as well, taking out sort of the high threat units on the other side of the board. And 4LW is actually sitting on a relatively weak hand. I definitely have to give this early game advantage over to Kelvin, who does have... this Avarosan Sentry to sort of accelerate the plan, line up onto that Arachnoid Sentry, and Swain coming out, but it's still just a turn too early.
Yeah, Swain, you love to have the Swain on curve, though, because that's the sort of thing is a lot of the units in this deck, even if when you have early followers, they're not really great aggressively statted. You really are playing them more to stall the game. It's all going to be about these Leviathans and these Swains and to some degree the Brahms. So one thing is that having Swain on curve is obviously the first really impactful unit you can play, but having the Fury of the North backup, if you wait one more turn, is going to prevent your Swain from dying to an enemy Culling Strike, which is huge.
Yeah, and with 3 Culling Strike in both decks, okay, I was about to say that I wouldn't be surprised to see both players sort of stall out on that Swain until it is out of the Culling Strike range, but he does have the Fury of the North mana available to him, so he does still have the option to sort of play that one out, and if Kelvin does go for the Culling Strike straight away, that does mean that, 4LW is going to have priority to go for this open attack, and 4LW, has to take this attack, right? Your opponent is probably just waiting until you attack the Culling Strike, and actually just passes it over.
Ooh, okay. I guess in that case you have two. It's because you have 2 Furies, right? So you're scared of double Culling Strike. But by being presented the opportunity to pass, you think, well, why would you play the Swain but not attack? Now you have mana to block double culling, and if you can keep this Swain stuck on the board and waste those removal spells, there are no more efficient ways to deal with this because it's got so much toughness. The advantage of the deck also works against itself.
Yeah, it was sort of an awkward scenario. I think that the pass from Kelvin did imply that they had a Fury of the North of their own, and 4LW decided that they weren't willing to make the trade of the Fury of the Norths for each other, as well as, push a fair amount of damage onto his Swain. And instead now debating this Culling Strike onto the Crimson Disciple. As we had mentioned, this is a pretty impactful card in the matchup, as it does kill both Braum and Swain. But, using it to prevent the 4 damage, I think, is a little impactful. These decks aren't running things like Death's Hand, if I'm right. Oh, no, they are running Death's Hand. So they have the full suite of things to sort of upgrade the Swain. It's not going to be too hard for them to do that. So maybe understanding that the chances of getting a Culling Strike down onto one of Kelvin's Swains, especially since it hasn't come down already, is going to be pretty impactful, as well as just, preserving your life total. There are some kindly Tavern Keepers in both of these decks, but you don't want to have to, use those to shore up most of an interaction off of something like this.
Yeah, given the second Culling Strike in hand and the degree to which this matchup is going to be dominated by the Swain Leviathan combo, I think this is 100% about slowing down your opponent's Swain level up. You got to think of it like the Ezreal matchups we've seen, where it's like you would go so far as to not play followers if it denies your opponent Ezreal targets. Like, yes, not taking 4 damage is really good, but making it so that your opponent's Swain won't level up until they have a Leviathan on board for, say, 2 turns is very powerful in the matchup. Unfortunately, the Fury does fizzle that and does make the 4 damage resolve, so now you've got a 6/6 Disciple to deal with temporarily.
Yeah, the one thing that was kind of interesting about the Culling Strike play there is that it seemed like 4LW had the read that Kelvin had that Fury of the North, and maybe you are just fine trading off that Fury for the Culling Strike, but now it looks like it's going to be a trade of Furies regardless out of 4LW, and this line of play does just make his previous turn a little bit more awkward.
Yeah, it seems like that maybe he obviously, the play last turn was to avoid this situation. Now Kelvin has, made this line that's kind of forced 4LW to accept what he took pains to avoid a moment ago.
Yeah, and 8 is a pretty precarious life total to be at, especially going into the Leviathan turn. You don't have a clean answer for that in your hand, and, Kelvin can just throw that down and sit on it. That's going to put you down to 5, and you're in a really rough position at a point like that.
Yeah, I mean, you would love to say that I've got my Swain in play already, and so my Leviathan's going to be more impactful, but not only is the Swain not leveled up just yet, but if you're that low on life, your opponent probably doesn't care if their board's stunned, because the Leviathan is going to chip away damage anyway. And it looks like you do have to make this block whether you want to or not.
Yeah, and there was a consideration, 4LW could have played this one a little bit differently, could have thrown the Swain underneath of that, on top of, let's say, the Imperial Demolitionist, block out this Crimson Disciple with the Avarosan Sentry. That does still push through 2 damage, but then you open it up to Ravenous Flock as a form of removal, which will also accelerate your Swain game plan, and now Ravenous Flock is actually going to kill his Swain.
That's so rough. You were really hoping that flock wasn't there. If you get to untap and you had another Fury, at least your Swain is preserved. But now, we saw those resources attempted at least to be spent earlier to deny Kelvin, points on the Swain level up. Now all of the, those Ravenous Flock points count as well. That Swain is well on its way. And okay, you have the first Leviathan down, but if Kelvin just Leviathans back here, the position looks a lot stronger for him.
Yeah, with the life total solely on the side of Kelvin, 4LW showed a little bit of hesitant in trading out these Fury of the Norths, and it did ultimately play against him with the way that the hands lined up, and now a Crimson Disciple out of Kelvin does mean there's no Leviathan, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the damage train is going to stop rolling, and, maybe 4LW doesn't want to risk this Leviathan with an attack, but I think he's got to sort of, clear up this gap in the life totals.
Yeah, by not attacking with that Swain earlier, you already passed up one opportunity to force damage. Now you're presenting the opportunity to Kelvin to pass back. I'm sure Kelvin wants to play another unit. Playing Crimson Disciple really strongly implies that, but you're going to waste the opportunity to attack with the Leviathan because preserving that life lead right now actually looks like the most important thing.
Yeah, and now 4LW, does have the Leviathan Swain online. Kelvin does not, and that is, it doesn't really matter what the life total looks like. If you're not low enough for your opponent to finish you off, and you can get this Swain Leviathan online while they do not, then you're in a pretty commanding position. But getting Swain down with a Crimson Disciple on board can be really scary for 4LW, who does not have a lot of blockers available to him at the moment.
Braum is going to be a big help in this case, at least if Braum is to take damage, then... you get a Poro, you get an additional blocker without having to play an additional card. But I mean, this is not by any stretch 4LW getting out of the woods. It's very clear right now. They're sort of just like scrambling to retain parity, but this deck is not great at doing that. Even playing the extra removal spells, extra board clear, that just doesn't line up well against his own deck.
Yeah, and it's really awkward because this it's going to take the Fury of the North out of 4LW to actually have this Braum line up as a blocker onto the Swain. And if, the Swain does get through uncontested, that is probably going to be too much damage for 4LW to handle. Kindly Tavern Keeper coming out, just continuing to build up the board. 4LW not wanting to commit their own Swain or I'm a little surprised not to see the Demolitionist come down onto the Braum and, sort of force out that Mighty Poro.
Yeah, and that would still preserve the Fury of the North, which seems like the only thing that you really care so much about holding up right now. I mean, I guess there might be some argument to also be holding Ravenous Flock to finish off the Swain afterwards.
Potentially. I mean, you do have this Noxian Fervor to activate the Braum if you really want to. I don't think you're going to be too upset if Kelvin just goes to combat right now. It does let you push a fair amount of damage onto that Swain and then finish it off with either the Fervor or the Ravenous Flock. Could even throw out the Fury of the North, but so far, Kelvin has the board advantage. 4LW has the Swain Leviathan combo, but doesn't actually get the Swain down this turn. And we're just going to see a little bit more chip damage coming out from this Leviathan. And I think this is the turn where 4LW really starts to take over the game in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think 4LW breathed a huge sigh of relief when that turn got passed back. I'm not saying that Kelvin was not having a plan in doing so, but at 12 life, if you took a bunch of damage there to try and preserve any sort of board, or were forced to take a risky commitment of cards and mana to try and take out, Kelvin's Swain, it would make you a lot more vulnerable. Whereas now you kind of actually get a free pass to try your own Swain combo, and there is Fury in hand as a backup. Like you mentioned, even before the match, the extra copy of Fury is so relevant because it does defeat a lot of the plays that can stifle this Swain play. And with Leviathan already on board, all it takes is one more spell to flip this Swain, and Kelvin is way on the back foot.
Yeah, could even throw out the Demolitionist onto the Braum if he wants to do that. I think he kind of held that back because he does want to sort of entice the Culling Strike onto the Swain and then be able to blow that out with either the Noxian Fervor or the Death's Hand. And I don't think there's anything Kelvin can do to really dodge one of those spells dealing as much damage as it needs to in order to, level up that Swain and get it out of range. And unless Kelvin has their own Leviathan coming down this turn, I think 4LW is just going to take this one completely over.
Yeah, I mean, this is one piece of tech that I would say a good number of the Braum Swain players were running is some level of frostbite, whether it be from the usually the Archer follower, but just having that access to that effect would keep these Culling Strikes relevant and present some sort of punishment for that kind of greedy play. But knowing that that's not in the list, 4LW is completely open to make this bait and to try and draw the spell onto the Swain. And at some point, Kelvin must feel forced to.
Yeah, the sort of question on how this turn plays out is, does 4LW want to proactively level the Swain this turn to get the 3 stuns off of the Leviathan, or are they fine just letting the Leviathan hit 3 times, that third one going to be with the leveled Swain and stunning out Kelvin's Swain?
With so much mana available and so many cards in hand, it seems like this Demolitionist play seems so good to me, because you still, if they attempt to react, you have more fast effects to still save the Swain and get the level up, and you want to generate blockers, but goes for the pass, trying to bait something out of Kelvin. And Kelvin does have 4 cards in hand. You're sort of tempting them to waste their mana. But are you scared of combat at this point if you don't level the Swain?
I mean, you are still going to stun your opponent's Swain no matter what, which is sort of the one attacker that you actually are afraid of. There's, a fair amount of burn available to Kelvin and 4LW in this matchup, but a lot of it has already been spent, and with the Culling Strike and the Ravenous Flock and the Noxian Fervor, 4LW has a lot of great defensive tools to the point where this Crimson Disciple is probably not going to be something that has the burn available to it, and we are going to see Fury of the North as the defense now for the Culling Strike. That card does get baited out here. And now it's a question of, how does 4LW want to play this combat phase? You do have this massive Braum now that you get to throw at something. I think it'd be phenomenal to sort of take out your opponent's Braum and get your, kind of get your Poro train running. And you can still throw out the Demolitionist or the Death's Hand in order to level up that Swain if you want to.
Yeah, this is seeing the Culling Strike, and I mean, it was smart to Culling Strike the Braum because obviously the Swain at this point would get out of range with any sort of damage effect in hand. It's very unlikely that resolves. So going for the Braum instead, which requires the Fury, but the Fury is there for 4LW, and I don't mind the idea of even pulling in my opponent's Swain, right? Like, not to tunnel vision too hard, but it is such a key card in this matchup. It's already leveled up for Kelvin. It's sort of the most impactful thing that you could generate. Okay, I guess we are pulling in the Braum. I would have thought you could have finished off maybe with the Flock and level up your own Swain in the same stroke. And that puts Kelvin, sort of a Swain and a Leviathan away, which is 2 turns worth of mana no matter what, from sort of reclaiming the board or answering the combo out of 4LW.
Yeah, it's a little bit strange. I mean, like, you can take out the Swain and then you have it off the board. It's completely dead. As you said, it'll level the Swain in the same stroke. I think 4LW is really considering that the Swain is kind of a non-factor at this point because it is just going to be constantly stunned out by his own Swain, as it is the strongest thing on board. But you do sort of open yourself up to these these opportunities for... Okay, the Noxian Fervor Hover was really confusing me. I kind of lost my train of thought there. But yeah, if you leave the Swain around, then your opponent does have the opportunity to get back into the game. As soon as they throw a Leviathan down, then they do have the combo available to them, as opposed to having to run it out over the course of a couple of turns once it gets drawn out. And I do really like going for the kill on the Swain here. The one sort of punish would be that second copy of Fury of the North out of Kelvin.
Yeah, I mean, there's always like a potential punish, and yes, to pull the Brahmin would be safer, but from a strategic perspective, this Brahmin is not even 4LW's most important card. As you mentioned, the most powerful unit on Kelvin's side is getting stunned no matter what, whether that's the Swain or whether that's something else. So, like, the board state right now is very in his favor. It's sort of just got to look to what can Kelvin fire back. And to me, that is definitely like, it's a risk to just consider the Swain dealt with by your own Swain's like stunning ability, when stunning it does not actually deactivate, Swain's effect.
Yeah, and we're going to see the Ravenous Flock, and this is really important. The mana lining up perfectly for 4LW does have the Death's Hand as a backup in case Kelvin did find that third Culling Strike to try and throw down onto the Swain. It's not going to be an option for him, and I think that 4LW has this one in the bag. Kind of no matter how this play turns out, Kelvin's cards in hand really just not lining up, not finding that Leviathan, the key card in this matchup, and doesn't even have anything to try and protect the Swain that is just going to die there to Ravenous Flock. And I don't know about you, but I absolutely love Swain's level up animation.
Oh, I love everything about Swain. Like, the card's design, when I first opened Runeterra, because I took a bit of a break from playing the game, I was required in other places, and when I came back, it was after the Rising Tides expansion, just like pouring all over the cards like a kid in a candy shop, and I hadn't previously really found my place with Noxus decks. Darius is fine, but, it's just aggro. I've seen aggro, and Swain is right up my alley. I love this kind of, like, janky, it's 3 power, but actually threatens 6 damage, and the flip effect is so powerful. The Leviathan is just an awesome card. All of the cool removal. Noxian Fervor is an incredible tool for just pressuring opponents to death. So I love this deck.
That's totally fair to say, and it looks like 4LW should be able to pick up the win on the next turn, as Kelvin is not going to have any fearsome blockers available to you, and as you mentioned, that Swain's going to come down and just deal 3 damage to everything on Kelvin's board. There's nothing they can do about it. The Leviathan coming just a little bit too late, and even going to have, the Demolitionist come down to stun out the Leviathan this turn to make sure that absolutely no damage gets pushed through onto him. 4LW really respecting the amount of burn that could come out of Kelvin here to try and finish him off.
Yeah, and this is when I said very early on that the thing that matters, and to some degree the only thing that matters in this matchup, is who gets this Leviathan Swain combo, because it is so overwhelmingly powerful. Every other card in the deck just switches it on, and the units, the individual cards outside of those two are not powerful enough to fight back against the combo. The only thing you can do is resolve the combo yourself. So now that 4LW has the board locked up and cleared away the Swain, the Leviathan that we assume Kelvin just didn't find in time has come down, but it by itself, when you don't have that oppressive life lead and board control, it's not going to do enough. Your units are permanently stunned. Swain is crashing in for absurd damage every turn. This is what it's all about. And you have to respect the tech adaptations these players have made, because in this aggro sort of populated top end of the contest, it has gotten them to top 4. But if one of these players were to, say, have a couple of Babbling Bjergs, you would not be in this situation of not drawing your Leviathan on curve. Just saying. Yeah,
it's definitely one of those things that plays against you in the mirror, and it always feels bad when you do have a very similar deck and one of you came completely teched for the field of the aggro, and then you eventually find yourself in the mirror match and your opponent is a little bit teched for the mirror. It definitely feels extremely punishing, because you did commit your resources to other matchups, but then you run into someone who didn't commit those resources and still made it just as far into the tournament as you did. And I was a little surprised not to see the Braum attack out of Kelvin. I think getting the Mighty Poro would have been pretty impactful, and is actually going to get that done thanks to the Noxian Fervor. So that is going to be, the 3 attack units stunned by the Leviathan on the following turn. But this does potentially set up Kelvin for a Ravenous Flock onto 4LW Swain.
And if you can, I was just talking about the power of the combo. There's no more Swains in hand for 4LW, and Kelvin still has 12 life, which is not, it's not none. There's a board full of followers there. If you can remove the Swain that's stunning everything, then suddenly you're kind of back into the game. Your cards are alive again.
Yeah, the one sort of awkward part is that there's no Noxian Guillotine coming out of either player, and 4LW does have that second Braum in hand. The Take Heart going to be able to actually protect that that Swain from a Ravenous Flock if it does come out, but that's not even going to be the case. And it looks like he's going to proactively Noxian Fervor just to clear out an additional blocker.
I maybe just worried that eventually Kelvin will draw enough removal since these decks are so heavy and he won't be able to protect the Swain like indefinitely. So trying to force the win sooner rather than later seems like a good idea.
Yeah, I'm definitely not mad at it. I don't think that, 4LW, it feels like he's just kind of feeling the pressure at this point. He has 8 mana. He feels a little compelled to play something. I don't think that he necessarily needs to, but he is still going to get the Swain attack on this turn. I don't think that there's anything that Kelvin can do about that outside of, that second copy of Fury of the North, because we do see him, sort of down a copy and just needs to find a way to block this Swain or, it's game over.
Yeah, the synergy of stunning the 3 strongest unit when you get paid so absurdly, handsomely well for crushing him with this fearsome Swain attacker is just chef's kiss. And now the second Leviathan in hand, it really is answer this Swain right now or be dead. And the answer is not there. Talk about animations.
I do really love that Swain animation as well.
And there you go. So the mirror, not unusual for a mirror to fall to the player who just drew to their payoff sooner rather than later, especially in what is, when you look at it plainly, a control deck, right? They each really only have a couple of threats, and one player found them.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that adaptation from 4LW. We managed that, touched on that one minor difference is that 4LW had the 3 copies of Fury of the North and only 1 Avalanche, whereas, Kelvin kind of split the difference on 2 and 2. And if either of those Fury of the Norths had been an Avalanche, we could have been looking at a pretty different game. Those Furies were all extremely impactful in the instances that they were played in.
Yeah, that's all I was thinking about when we were looking at those in hand. You hit the nail right on the head, and it's something even I didn't... obviously Fury of the North is a powerful card, but it's really striking home in these control mirrors again and again. It's very similar to Twin Disciplines in the Heimerdinger deck. Just having a burst buff spell when so much of the removal, even Culling Strike, which is not damage-based, is conditional on the stats of your target. So Fury of the North is almost a deny for these sort of Freljord Noxus decks when it comes to protecting their key unit. And we just saw it. As long as you can protect Swain, you're home and dry in these matchups. Yeah,
and of course, that Culling, I have to think back to that Culling Strike play onto the Braum that was met up by the Fury of the North, and then all of a sudden, you have this 5/9 Braum that hasn't taken damage yet that all of a sudden gets to attack. Your opponent's shields are kind of down. They already tried to throw the removal spell out, and that was obviously the turning point of the game was the Leviathan coming down for one player and not coming down for the other one. It feels really bad when you're both playing the same deck and one of you finds the win condition and the other one doesn't, especially because Kelvin actually did have just a smidge more draw power, I think. Both players did actually find the Avarosan Sentry, so they both sort of found the same amount of draw, but as you had mentioned, potentially if we see this deck come out in the future, maybe we'll see those Bjergs added back in to sort of play towards the mirror.
Yeah, it seems like it's a relatively new deck, and people were clearly very different in their assessment of how much they needed to guard against aggro. Some players seem to tech quite heavily against it, others not. Definitely, I think these were the only 2 players who did not bring Bjerg. Some players bringing 2. Maybe someone even brought 3, I seem to recall. So definitely other players are really tunnel visioning on, I just have to get this Leviathan. Leviathan draws my Swain. These 2 cards together are a game-winning combination. But I love the Fury of the North as an adaptation, and perhaps, if you don't want to lean into just tunnel visioning on the combo, even just, you mentioned Noxian Guillotine, that's a card that hasn't shown up at all in this meta, and if people are swinging back towards, if not wide mid-range boards, then at least large individual followers and large individual units to avoid dying to damage-based removal, the Guillotine is a huge blowout in that situation.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we haven't seen, for example, Noxian Guillotine seen anywhere near the playability that, for example, Execute did in Hearthstone's early days is because in Hearthstone, and this might seem like a small thing, but Hearthstone had Whirlwind, which was just 1 mana deal 1 to everything on board. While Noxus does have Death Lotus, that only hits things that are in combat, and because of the way that the priority sequences line up, it can be a little bit awkward to try and actually get Guillotine down onto priority targets in a meaningful way. You do typically have to commit a few more resources than you would really like to get that done, and it doesn't really pair super well into these Darius Harrowing decks, which is why I think we've seen it cut from a lot of these lineups, just because you can block onto the Basilisk Rider, but then the damage is already done, you've already lost your unit, and now you're losing another card for the Noxian Guillotine, and it's really, really difficult to line up enough Noxian Guillotines to take advantage of the fact that it does give you that extra fleeting copy.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The fact that the dominant removal decks of the format don't allow you a chance to favorably block even to chomp block and put a bit of damage that makes your guillotine an effective trade. It's not effective when you're already losing the hit points that deck is banking on you losing in order to set it up. So you would need to have, some sort of broader damaging effect, or I guess count on your opponent to damage some of their own units. But I mean, if you're playing avalanches already, surely it's only a small step further. I don't know.
Maybe it also doesn't pair super well into, for example, like the Ionia, the Ionia PZ decks. Like you generally, if you're killing or if you're damaging Ezreal or Heimerdinger, you're generally doing enough damage to kill it. Especially if you are in like Noxus Freljord, it's not like you're lining up a Vile Feast into the Noxian Guillotine. And now for LW, looks like they have a bit of an awkward hand here. Once again, we see that those 3 concussive palms lining up in the opening hand of Karma Ezreal player.
It seems very statistically unlikely, but the monks are just showing up they love the spotlight today. I mean, it's not the worst card to be overloaded on just because you can play it somewhat proactively. And in fact, that's what we saw, done to great effect in the previous round, right? Like, if nothing else, and if the game is going slow for both players, you can kind of force things a little bit by saying, well, I have some 3/2 monks. What are you going to do about these, huh? Going to play some cards? But, I mean, I don't know if that works as well against the TF Ezreal, because, as we pointed out, the whole strength of choosing this build of Ezreal is that you can just go faster if you want to.
Yeah, and of course being able to steal some of the high priority cards out of 4LW's deck, who we don't actually see have any of those in hand. We're talking about Denies, we're talking about Will of Ionias, we're talking about, there's a couple of things, these Eye of the Dragons already, kind of coming up for 4LW, but he doesn't have like Mystic Shots or Get Excited really lined up, and this is where the TF Ezreal deck kind of switches gears and goes more towards that Pilfer deck that we've seen in the past, where you just kind of run out these lower tempo units. We're even going to see a Mystic Shot to be able to push through as much damage as possible on the open attack on the following turn. And this is why I constantly compare this deck to sort of the Bannerman of old, where, you've got this just extremely board-centric tempo-style deck, and if you don't tempo out, generally that's where you falter, and that's why these decks have switched over to that sort of Ezreal backup plan.
Yeah, it is really interesting that they are, like, it's sort of 2 different styles that you're mashing up into one deck. I wouldn't have necessarily expected, I'll go wide with my Petty Officer, and then, but on, like, turn 10, I'll have leveled my Ezreal. Like, those sound weird, but, as long as both plans are individually powerful enough, and the fact that you can aggressively play your Ezreal, and the fact that these NAB package cards do actually give you great late-game potential in terms of, like, card draw and mana efficiency, kind of enables you in that regard.
Yeah, I definitely, like I said a lot yesterday, it feels like this TF Ezreal deck is sort of a direct counter to the Karma Ezreal, just because, you don't have a lot of activators for the Ezreal on your own, but if you can just steal your opponents out with these extremely efficient cards, especially getting mana reductions onto them thanks to something like the Black Market Merchant, then, you suddenly have all the tools available to you that Karma Ezreal does. You're going to be able to play a little bit more towards this Ezreal win condition, and because of Riptide Rex, you're almost certainly going to level yours faster than your opponent does, even though you're constantly going low and wide on board. The anti-aggro package out of the Karma Ezreals is a lot more, stall-based than removal-based. It's concussive palms, it's Will of Ionias. These small, jagged butchers constantly coming out in pairs and multiples isn't something that the Karma Ezreal decks in the format are currently equipped to deal with in a meaningful way.
Yeah, how do you use Will of Ionia against this board? You can't. You cannot play a 4-mana spell to bounce a 1-drop back to hand. You don't want to reset the Shadow Assassin. So, that card's effectively out of the game for now. You've got Static Shock, but that doesn't line up well against 3/3s or even 2/2s. It really does, take advantage of sort of a blind spot in what these decks are built to combat, and that's why it's paid off, I think, for several people in our top 16, and Kelvin now taking it all the way to the top 4. The question is, does this, how many more of those cards in hand synergize with this aggressive plan? And if, say, 4LW finds a second Static Shot and is able to mop up a couple of these attackers, or is able to get enough value out of these dragons, then, can Kelvin finish the job?
Yeah, and it would be a little bit strange to see Kelvin actually not pick up the win in this matchup. It seems like, these are 2 decks, the Braum Swain and this TF Ezreal, are 2 decks that we've really highlighted as counters to the Karma Ezreal, which 4LW is running a very standard version of. If Kelvin can't, pick up the win here in the top 4 against the favored matchup, it's got to feel really bad for him, and he's going to go home kicking himself, wondering what he could have played differently, knowing that his deck should be advantaged in a situation like this, and he made it this far because the game plan's been working out for him, but now he does have his back against the wall, and if he can't deal with these Eye of the Dragons, then 4LW is suddenly in a very good position.
Yeah, and the one thing you mentioned is that, Kelvin doesn't have a lot of Ezreal activators. That also means it just doesn't have a lot of burn, like a lot of removal at all. There's 3 Mystic shots, but those aren't going to deal with the 1-3 alone. So we're looking at Thermo Beams or a bit of a Fortunate Make It Rain and some follow-up. It is not straightforward, and this is just deal with your opponent's like smallest follower. This is kind of this little low investment thing that you have to now answer because it's threatening your tempo plan.
Yeah, but the scary part for 4LW is that if he does lose this matchup, I'm not sure that he's actually going to be able to beat the Braum Swain. That is, one of the big things that we highlighted about that deck, and now he's going to fall to 10 life here unless he wants to fire off this Concussive Palm, which I think he is going to be inclined to do. The awkward part is you really don't want to line up the blocks with these Eye of the Dragons, and not getting the immediate value of the Dragonlings out of them does give Kelvin this 1-turn window to press the advantage, and he's going all out.
Yeah, this is it. As you said, the big turn. So, how can you best spend these somewhat out of place interactive spells? You have to, those are the only tools you have available right now. And right now, you're very happy you have those Palm of the Dragons in your opener, I think, because at least they are doing work here.
Yeah, and it looks like even with these blocks lined up, even with putting his one of his Eye of the Dragons at risk, he's still taking 4 damage because these Will of Ionias are so bad in a matchup like this. You don't want to reset the Jagged Butcher. You don't want to, give him another 1-drop off the Petty Officer, another draw off the Shadow Assassin, and next turn is the Riptide Rex turn. So with Kelvin hanging on to this many cards and, being okay going for the open attack, I have to assume that he's got one of those in hand.
Is it at some point worth it just to will the Shadow Assassin? Like, it's bad in the long game, but at least then you're planning for a longer game than dying next turn.
I think it is a little bit short-sighted just because, it does get your opponent closer to that Riptide Rex, which is, you don't have an answer for that in Karma Ezreal because they are 7 unique instances of Riptide firing off. You can't just deny the whole ability. I think any play that you make to get your opponent a little bit closer to there, you're not going to feel great about, especially if you do see it come off the top. And I don't think you necessarily need to preserve the 3 life or the 2 life. As long as you line up your blocks like this and you do manage to just go down to 10 life instead of 8, that's a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, it seems like a real problem for a deck that is playing for the late game in Karma Ezreal to not have answers to just an 8-drop that's standard in every Bilgewater deck. But I suppose that, a lot of these players have gone unpunished for it, so maybe not as big a weakness as you might think. Yeah,
I'm really not sure what... That's sort of the power of the Riptide Rex is, like, while he is a little bit RNG dependent on how he's going to wipe the board, I'm not sure what cards you could even play to, sort of prevent that. The only deck that we see that not line up well into is Sea Monsters, and that's because they have a 0-13 with toughness.
Yeah, I mean, the Vi, like you mentioned, kind of insulates the Heimerdinger deck from it, but that's not available here. And, I mean, you could try and prevent the Plunder effect from triggering, but against Warding Shot and all these small, followers we've already discussed, your removal does not line up well against. You're going to be trading life for time, and then the Rex is just going to punish you for that.
Yeah, and it looks like Kelvin is kind of, agonizing over the decisions to be made. I would imagine that it's a Make It Rain that he's thinking about trying to... Oh, it is just going to be a Mystic Shot actually taking out the healthy Eye of the Dragon because, you do want to prevent those Dragonlings on 4LW's attack turn. You don't really have much that you could do to stop them from gaining that life, and you do want to keep them at as stagnant a life total as possible.
Yeah, so that Keg coming in big handy there, and now with only one life left, you have to imagine the other Eye of the Dragon does not have long for this world either.
No, and that is going to be the second Mystic Shot firing down, and that means that 4LW not going to be able to sort of claw his way back into the game with the Claws of the Dragon. Or is that Eye of the Dragon? Man, I had such a good pun set up, and it was the wrong part of the dragon.
Eyeing his way back into the game with doesn't quite work. Still, okay, we found the Ezreal. So Ezreal and Karma here. We're on turn 8, so like you're assembling the tools, but when you're not against an equally slow deck, you kind of really feel the greed of this game plan, and we might even have to run the Ezreal out preemptively.
Yeah, and this is really scary for 4LW because the Karma will not be leveled on the next turn. Getting that combo online is sort of your one, late game insurance play, and it doesn't matter what the matchup is. If you get down a leveled Karma and a leveled Ezreal, you are suddenly heavily favored in that game as long as you have a couple of spells in hand. And we do see the deep meditation here. Kelvin doesn't necessarily say that he doesn't have a Riptide Rex by getting down the Yordle Grifter, perhaps just didn't have the Plunder activator for the turn, and now guaranteed has it on the next one.
So, is there anything 4LW you can do if that's the case, or you just have to play as though there is no Rex and hope?
I don't think there's anything you can do about the Rex. You kind of just have to clean up what you can. We're probably going to see this gotcha come down this turn at the reduced cost, and actually not going to be the case. Wanting to float the spell mana instead seems a little bit weird to me. I think you're going to have to fire that off next turn onto that Yordle Grifter. Might as well, get it down while it's got the reduced cost on it.
Yeah, you'd lose out one spell mana by not spending anything now, and you're going to be paying one more for that removal spell next turn, which you'll presumably want to use.
Actually, hold on, throw all this out the window. I remembered how priority works. He passed with after playing a burst spell, so he will get a chance to play another card before the turn actually ends.
Oh, okay.
So we could still see this gotcha come out.
Right. See, this is my relative inexperience with the game. There's still moments where I get caught out and the priority system confuses me in this game, but it does open up some really cool plays like this, and you manage to bluff out the Ezreal, draw it out from Kelvin, and that's a huge target for gotcha. It is a gotcha moment.
Yeah, he got us, he got Kelvin, everybody got by this gotcha by 4LW, and it's playing off for him. He's now going to fire off the Mystic Shot as well onto just, any of these 2 health units. It looks like it will be the Shadow Assassin, just kind of not worry about that elusive. I think throwing it off into the Petty Officer or the Shadow Assassin, either one of those is really fine. Either way, you're really dead to a Riptide Rex, so that's all this really comes down to is, does Kelvin have it or does he not?
I like targeting the 3-2, because then if your top deck is in, the happiest scenario, a Static Shock, you are looking really nice. But again, of course, you first have to dodge the Riptide Rex, which we say dodge, that implies 4LW has any agency in the matter. The warning shot is right there. 4LW has been warned. If there is also a Riptide Rex, then this is just like a very slow matter of procedure for Kelvin. And if that's the case, as Kelvin looking slightly ahead to the next game, you bought this Braum Swain deck. It must have been heartbreaking to lose that first mirror, but you might earn your way into it, the favored matchup that you brought that deck to combat this Karma Ezreal.
Yeah, and I think that the way that Kelvin has played out this turn is very telling that he does have a Riptide Rex. That's really the only reason I could think to play the Ezreal at the end of the turn, is you want to have that on board when the Riptide does level it up.
Yeah, so would have gotten a little bit of extra value. Going for the attack here first, even just trying to soften things up as much as possible from 4LW. This gives 4LW priority, but that probably doesn't matter if Rex is the play.
Yeah, and I think 4LW is going to have to fire off a few more removal spells than he's necessarily comfortable with. Kelvin doesn't have to fire off this warning shot, can just save it for another turn a little bit later on, maybe save it for the leveled up Ezreal that's going to come down. But Riptide Rex does just end the game if this Mystic Shot is the only thing we see come out, as it'll just deal 7 to the face since 4LW has no units.
And the fact that 4LW still doesn't have the leveled Karma this turn makes 4LW's options to punish anything so low. There's really no reaction. Even if there's not a Rex this turn, I guess 4LW starts to maybe look, you lay down an Ezreal at the end of this turn and untap and go for Karma. Start to think hopefully about the future.
Yeah, and it looks like he has decided that if there's Riptide Rex, then I will just die to it. I can't do anything about it. I need to get down my Karma and Ezreal this turn, and that's really my only shot at winning this game. We already see the Ezreal at 10 out of 8. You hate to see it come down. This kind of ineffectively. We've already seen multiple spells fired off that the Ezreal wasn't, sort of a part of. And now Riptide Rex does just represent lethal, as it will push 5 damage onto the face, followed by the warning shot. And that is going to be 4LW falling here, and has a very large uphill battle to sort of go off into this Braum Swain matchup.
And just looking pensively at the Karma trapped in hand on dying on turn 9. Has to feel bad. I mean... As we all wait. Okay, we figured it out. They saw the line, everybody.
The 0 mana revealed card that says deal 1 damage to my 1 health opponent. We finally figured it out. It took a couple seconds, but 4LW definitely has their back against the wall at this point now. We've praised this Braum Swain deck as such a smart adaptation into the Ezreal Karma, and it looks like Kelvin does finally get to line up onto that favorable matchup that he totally tailored his lineup for. And with 3 Karma Ezreals being left in the top 4, Kelvin actually feels like he's pretty well poised to win this entire tournament.
Yeah, you mentioned yesterday, and the words are coming back to me now, clear as day, that, the Braum Swain deck, it's a nice adaptation for this tournament because of no bans, but it's not as useful to beat the Karma Ezreal up with one deck if you can't find a second deck to beat it up. I mean, I'm not saying like for sure this Ezreal TF deck is the answer, but that looks like a pretty strong factor in the matchup as well.
I'm going to say that it is the answer because it bodied me on ladder when I was trying to play Karma Ezreal, and I want to feel validated in thinking that it was a very specific counter. Kelvin is absolutely my hero right now, proving me right and making me not feel as bad for my losses.
I mean, when we looked at how the cards lined up there, it looks smart as all hell. You have the early pressure you play, you have the same late game threat, you make your opponent's removal bad in a slightly different way to the Swain Brown deck does, and you have Riptide Rex as this like very terrifying top end that naturally exploits weaknesses of the Karma Ezreal deck, their empty board, their reliance on deny, their relative lack of healing. Like again, it's just one health potion in this list. So, you know, that the burn plan that comes outside of just relying on, well, my burn spells when I've got my leveled Karma or my leveled Ezreal out, like the actual burn plan from TF Ezreal is very frightening.
Yeah, and we had mentioned that Eye of the Dragon was sort of like the one way for 4LW to come back into that matchup, but they did both get cleaned up by Kelvin thanks to, you know, the blocks that he had to throw out of it. And now we're going to see, you know, some a bit of a slow start from Kelvin, a bit of an uncharacteristically slow start, actually. You know, you would like to see some of the Crimson Disciples coming down in these early turns, but apparently just not finding it. And it is a little bit awkward. We have to go back to that one difference between the two Braum Swain lists, because I do think that this second Avalanche that Kelvin has brought over, that second Veer of the North, really does not play well into this matchup either.
Yeah, I mean, we're not trying to dunk on Kelvin for bringing the extra Avalanche, right? It's just an adaptation for an opponent that, unfortunately, has already been knocked out of the tournament. So from here on out, that Avalanche is going to be a white albatross around your neck, and you're going to groan every time you draw it, because it's just not going to be efficient against these kinds of decks that you're now playing against. It is only one extra card, though, so that does not really hurt the overall strength of the deck, apart from just somehow bricking on Avalanches. What can 4LW kind of line up? Because when you're in this kind of disadvantageous matchups, you do have to kind of review your deck, review how it plays, and even for a deck that's sort of as linear in its win condition as this, wonder how you can maybe thread through, even if it requires your opponent to draw a certain string of unlucky cards, play for that out.
The one thing that 4LW does sort of have control over in this instance is if he can get that Karma to stick on turn 6 and can generate, you know, more copies of Will of Ionia, is I really think what he's going to look for in a matchup like this, and maybe Thermogenic Beam as well. We had talked a lot about how the specific strength of this deck into the Karma Ezreal is how healthy some of these units are, but they're expensive units. They're hard to kill, but they're not hard to just return to your hand in a mana inefficient way.
Yeah, having your Leviathan or your Swain return to hand, like, okay, if you return Leviathan, you draw another Swain, that's not really, like, it's not returning a Shadow Assassin. That's an 8-cost unit. Bouncing that for 4 in a deck that, like, only really takes so many turns to win the game is a huge, huge blowout. So you're right, and looking at the removal that's available, apart from, you know, there actually aren't that many great options to kill the Karma on turn 6. It's not like when you're playing against these other Ionia Piltover decks where the card's really vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, you do have the potential of Anoxian Fervor, but that's weak to some of the cards that 4LW could play for 3-spell mana, like this Get Excited. I think your best bet is like the Arachnoid Sentry into the Ravenous Flock, and maybe that's why we don't see a Flock come out onto the Shadow Assassin, because this Sentry does seem a little bit awkward here, just stunning the Shadow Assassin on the off turn, just wanting to preserve the life as much as possible. But I would think that 4LW would want to use, Kelvin rather, would want to use a card like that a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah, the sentries definitely seem to be in the deck as an enabler to ensure that those Ravenous Flocks become useful. Because obviously you have 3 copies of Ravenous Flock, and then any spare Swains become Ravenous Flocks, and you are more likely than not to have spare Swains because of Leviathan drawing you extra copies. So you do want to make sure that you have some other ways to stun in the deck, and people have just determined seemingly that Arachnoid Sentry is it. You get an extra body as well, but, you know, maybe Kelvin feels pressured to generate a board. You mentioned this was kind of a slow start. If you're stuck with a lot of these sort of more utility-focused followers in hand, maybe you've got an Innkeeper and an Arachnoid Sentry, and maybe like a Demolitionist with no target. Like, which of those do you play first for bad value? You know, not happy choices to make.
Yeah, and 4LW, I think this is about as good as their hand could get if they do want to try and pick up a win in this matchup. They do have the potential to try and just run out their Karmas until Kelvin is out of removal spells for those. Does have the Karma Ezreal, you know, sort of online already, has that Static Shock getting off a couple of targets. Does mean that, you know, they're going to be about as close to the Ezreal level as they could hope to be at a point like this. I'm just not sure that it's necessarily going to be enough.
Yeah, I mean, it really, unfortunately, we're only approaching the turns where it starts to really matter. And here's the Swain, because again, like, this is not the Frostbite control list playing all those Trifarian cards that are like big and threatening on their own. The curve in this Braum Swain deck, such as it is really just a bunch of utility cards that are there to draw cards or enable your spells or chip a bit of face damage, and then Swain and Leviathan. It's a Swain and Leviathan deck, and like Braum is a little bit of good value in between. So now that Swain's on board, like, this is the first real test before LW.
Yeah, and he's only got one Will of Ionia, so he's going to survive the Swain on this turn, but that's, not as big a mana commitment as something like the Leviathan, but, you have kind of committed to it by letting the Swain get to the point of attack. I really don't think there was any other great option. You could line up double Get Excited, but that does not seem good, especially since Kelvin still has Fury of the North mana.
That seems an unreal kind of risk to take when your tournament life is on the line. Just commit, you have a Will of Ionia, commit the Will of Ionia, and, like you said, hope that you can jam a Karma and maybe generate another copy before you have to face this test again.
Yeah, because there is nothing, in 4LW's hand that lines up into this Swain once it does come back down on the following turn. These Eye of the Dragons aren't going to get any value just yet, and 4LW, you could fire off the Rummage to try and actually get that second spell down for the turn to create these Dragonlings, but it's only actually going to gain you 1 life, and it seems like kind of a big commitment. You don't have any great discards. I think you're much better off trying to jam Karma after Karma rather than, discarding one of them to the Rummage.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, your removal doesn't line up that well against the Swain, but your opponent's removal doesn't necessarily line up the best against your Karma, so at least trying to put some sort of pressure on Kelvin to do something other than just flop the Swain back down again with presumably Fury of the North backup that makes your removal irrelevant. I mean, it does seem like the best line. Just suddenly be proactive. The board is clear for a moment, and 4LW can try and steal the initiative.
Yeah, and I think it would have been maybe the consideration was that if you Rummage here, you're not so much concerned about your own life total, but it does represent 4 damage onto your opponent with those Dragonlings. But with 3 Kindly Tavern Keeper in the deck, I don't think that's getting the unit damage down is a very realistic strategy against this deck in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about how much this Karma Ezreal deck focuses on sculpting the win in hand and then committing in one combo turn. We've seen it go bad for players multiple times already when they start trying to throw burn spells at face without the extra payoff of a leveled Ezreal or leveled Karma, and I think that's the case here. I think that the Swain Leviathan win condition is going to come down and close on you before you ever get in range of that burn plan, if that's what you start committing your mana to right now.
Yeah, and 4LW does pick up the Thermogenic Beam, sort of the second answer for these Swains and Leviathans in the deck, but looks like they are actually going to fire off the Karma instead. Fury of the North could come out as a potential blowout onto this Thermogenic Beam, but it would only leave the Swain at 1 HP. I don't think that's enough for him to realistically survive, the Static Shock and get excited on the following turn. But 4LW understands that this is a matchup where they are on the back foot. If you play Standard, you're going to lose more often than not, but it looks like they are actually deciding the Swain is too much of a threat. I'm going to fire off the Thermogenic Beam rather than, risking it all on this Karma, and this is the safer play.
Yeah, for sure. If there was another Will of Ionia in hand, if there was some answer to like Swain just immediately attacking you, then I think we would see the Karma come out, because it would be hugely valuable to kind of like steal a Karma trigger at this stage in the game, and the spell you get could be game winning, but it could also be irrelevant, and Swain could just punch you, and that would be like extremely detrimental as 4LW tries to sort of tiptoe through this very difficult matchup. So is there the blowout? We are waiting a long time on Kelvin. Again, you would imagine that if there was a Fury, you'd just snap it off.
I don't think he would, because it does only leave the Swain at 1 HP. That's pretty unlikely to survive on the attack of the following turn. I think he's got the Fury, and he's kind of debating it over in his head, but I don't think it's worth it, really.
Okay, well, I mean, assuming that Kelvin also has the Leviathan, right? And next turn, he's untapping with 8. Is jamming that Leviathan enough pressure? Obviously you're then redrawing a copy of Swain, so the pressure is then immediately back on 4LW to remove it, but you can only play the Leviathan this turn and then Swain the turn after. Is that getting too slow? We are starting to creep towards turn 10. There's 2 Karmas in hand, still 19 life on 4LW.
Yeah, it looks like, okay, the Fury is going to be the answer, and he better hope and pray that he has a second copy, because this Static Shock should not be getting value onto a Swain like this, and I do think that the Swain is still, pretty decently far off of actually leveling here.
Yeah. I guess this is only one target for Ezreal, even if it results, but I would imagine the second Fury's there, or maybe you're just hoping the Static Shock's not available.
Yeah, Yeah, it is actually just going to die, and we could still see the Leviathan post-combat, and maybe the consideration was it's going to be a while before this Fury of the North actually gets played. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 4LW commit mana to killing the Swain outside of the Thermogenic Beam they've already committed, and that frees me up to play the Leviathan on the following turn. And I think that was sort of what he was agonizing over with the Fury of the North, and why he ultimately decided to go for it, even though there was almost no chance that the Swain was actually going to connect on face.
Yeah, forcing 4LW to spend mana this turn means that the Thermo Beam doesn't line up against the Leviathan anymore, where otherwise you would be like, you do not want to pass turn with an empty board, because that puts 4LW back in the driver's seat. Now there's still you're making your opponent untap with a 5/8 Leviathan in their face, shooting them for damage, which is leveling the Swain that you just drew, and you're going to create a lot of pressure to remove Leviathan and this extra Swain copy next turn for 4LW.
And Static Shock is kind of the card that you were hoping specifically to be able to kill your Swain. Literally anything other than Mystic Shot and you would have been fine, because now 4LW doesn't have the opportunity to get the Karma developed on the board on the turn where Kelvin's shields are completely down. You wanted to run out this Leviathan and not have your opponent have a strong follow-up play, and that is exactly what this Fury of the North onto the Swain has provided Kelvin.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily knocking 4LW's decision-making. As you mentioned, these are kind of the only safe decisions, but what we're seeing is the reason this is a matchup that seems to favor Braum Swain so heavily is just that there are very few options available to the Karma player when you're just facing this chain of giant minions. Starting, we've seen now 2 turns in a row where the Karma has 4LW's clearly wanted to play her out, but it just has not been possible because you cannot allow these giant threats to sit on Kelvin's side of the board.
Yeah, and it looks like this turn 9 play is where things get a little bit awkward. That you want to try and develop either the Karma or the Ezreal to get one of those on board and play mana efficiently, and get those out before your opponent is able to really put the pressure on with this Swain Leviathan combination, because the Swain is still a little bit far from the level up. It looks like a 6 out of 12, though I can't tell for sure, but it looks like 4LW is going to continue with the safe lines of play and just pass it back over, and I'm not sure that the safe lines are how you can win this matchup, even though they do look very appealing.
Yeah, I mean, by passing back to your opponent, you challenge them to be scared and let the turn pass. They could have an attack with the Leviathan or whatever, but I don't really see any reason Kelvin would be discouraged from playing the Swain at this point, right? Like, this is not a matchup where, I've got to protect my Swain from getting culling striked or something. It's still a 3/6. It's going to be all right. You've got a 5/8 Leviathan on board, and then you're, very threatening to flip the Swain sooner rather than later and starting to make things impossible for 4LW.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious to see if Kelvin is actually going to run out the Swain this turn, or if they're just kind of fine to sit here and pass back and forth with. You see 4LW with 10 cards in hand would sort of get the worst end of the deal, and yeah, this Will of Ionia onto the Leviathan, 4LW is just kind of waiting for the perfect opportunity for it and does find it, and I think this means that they're going to get the Ezreal down this turn. You are tapped out of the Karma mana, but I think you need this Karma on board to actually, get the Ezreal level up by throwing off multiple Get Exciteds onto a couple of units, and that is sort of your best answer for the Swain at the moment, who is still a little bit too far off of the level up to survive something like that.
So is it worth Kelvin committing this Swain, or is Kelvin going to be forced to bank a lot of mana this turn, presuming that there is, going to be a Karma coming down sort of as soon as possible next turn? Oh, no, just Swain. All right.
Yeah, the Swain makes sense. You are still banking 3 spell mana into the following turn, and 4LW is actually going to understand that they need to kind of hold back this Ezreal until it actually is leveled, and then try to fire off as many things as possible. It is a little bit scary that they haven't been able to get this Karma down, but they have safely made it into turn 10, and now we could see the game start to swing back in 4LW's favor, still at a much higher life total than you would have expected. No Brahms coming out of Kelvin's deck really has played against him at this point, just not being able to find that champion.
Yeah, I think without Braum, you're kind of seeing a chink in the armor of this Noxus Freljord deck, because a lot of the other cheap followers do not actually work very well with an aggressive plan, do not stand up as well to this early game removal, a lot of 3/2s and 2/1s and that sort of thing. So without Braum generating a meaty 3/3 Poro and threatening to flip over, and when your on-curve Swain kind of gets answered by one of those few cards that can do it, you suddenly drift closer to the area where you're scared of the Karma Ezreal combo winning the game.
Yeah, and 4LW even just holding back a little bit longer, does get this chump bump down, does have the option to get the Karma out on the following turn. I guess did I misrepresent the mana, or am I just confused about what's going on here? I think I just got a little bit lost in the sauce here, but Kelvin, the Swain has the attack token on the following turn. 4LW doesn't actually have a clean way to stop the Swain from hitting them in the face. Can play the Ezreal, but that's not an effective blocker, and you really don't want to run out double Get Excited before you get the Karma down.
Yeah, Kelvin, I think, sensed that there's probably the Ezreal and was debating about whether you try and save removal to kill it, or whether you try and, like, set up a Swain attack, and ultimately just decided that I'll control the board and come what may, because now, you know, even if you play Ezreal, can't block the fearsome Swain, the Swain is very close to flipping, could even potentially flip pre-hit, depending on what effects Kelvin has in hand, and then, like, you're going to clear the board immediately with the Swain, and have a Leviathan to lay down if you so wish.
And this mushroom is the second this isn't even the second spell of the turn, is it?
I thought it was.
Okay, it was the second. I didn't, when he was scrolling up through the thing, I didn't actually see. Oh yeah, the Will of Ionia was played a little bit earlier.
Down for Leviathan. It's just a very long turn. Both players, like, recognizing we are getting, like, every turn matters a ton at this point in the game, because 4LW has actually managed to, like, sort of nurse this little hope through to the end game stage where Kelvin must realistically consider, you know, their odds of dying on any given turn to just Karma, Ezreal, burn. This is the play they wanted to line up, though.
Yeah, and 4LW has actually just had an extremely fortunate string of top decks thus far. We kind of mentioned that Will of Ionia and Thermogenic Beam are really the only cards that have impact in a matchup like this, and so far he's done, you know, he opened with that Will of Ionia, and since then has drawn the last two copies as well as a Thermogenic Beam, and so far has just been, you know, very rewarded for, you know, finding the right cards in this matchup. Although, you know, if he gets the Karma down here and it does die to something, though, this should be a lot safer now that it is on that 4 health line. Noxian Fervor kind of off the table as a removal option for it, but we could still see something like a Sentry into a Ravenous Flock to take this one out.
Yeah, there's any number of 2-card combinations Kelvin could have, but at least you're forcing him to have 2-card combinations now, and there is a second Karma in hand. So, yeah, suddenly Kelvin's one on the back foot. It's still 17 life to chip away, and that's the thing, like I said, this Freljord Noxus deck doesn't really push a lot of damage, so even though it's great at controlling the board, and it can be hard to deal with if it ever gets on top of the the Karma Ezreal deck, you kind of just close things out in like 2 hits. We never saw that strike home because, yeah, the Will of Ionias, and I find it hard to be upset at 4LW for drawing those, because we saw 4LW draw the Will of Ionias in the matchup where they were terrible and die to it. So the fact that they're showing up here when they're needed is, I guess, kind of just turnabout being fair play.
Yeah, and I'm a little surprised that, you know, things have gone this way. There are a lot of early game tools available to Kelvin. Crimson Disciple, Kindly Tavern Keeper, even just being a 3/3. You know, most importantly, that Demolitionist Disciple combo and things of that nature, the Braum that we never saw come out. And those are sort of key things that you need to line up in the early game to actually put the pressure on. And instead, 4LW, because of all of these, you know, copies of Will of Ionia coming out, has just stumbled turn in and turn out playing this Swain and replaying this Leviathan.
And now we see the Avalanche come out. So again, this is the card, this is probably the most value you're ever going to get from it. But, like, yeah, I mean, no one's playing Bjerg for its value as a body, but at least it's another body, and you are playing this Swain deck kind of dancing in a delicate spot between, I want to play tons of sort of damage and removal spells, and I also want to, you know, close things out on my opponent in a realistic time frame. If you draw Ravenous Flocks and Culling Strikes, you are not killing this Karma Ezreal deck.
And it looks like 4LW is actually considering, like, throwing out double Get Excited for 12 damage at Kelvin's face. I think it, you know, makes a little bit more sense to play the Ezreal post-combat and then sort of see where you can get with that one. But I do think 4LW, with this Karma double Get Excited, is in a position where he can actually just pick up the win.
Yeah, this is taking so much removal now, so much effort from Kelvin. You see the hand size starting to dwindle to take away a Karma. There's a second Karma and an Ezreal in hand, and we're, like, well into the territory of the Karma Ezreal deck here. So Kelvin's lineup built to prey on this deck. And this is the Braum Swain deck we've seen have success against it all weekend, but whether it's because of a rough draw, extremely good draws from 4LW, or maybe just teching too far away from the matchup you brought this deck to beat, it looks as though we might see, you know, the thin side of that matchup wedge come to play here. Yeah,
and with 10 mana available for both players, and 4LW being able to push through this damage, unless Kelvin blocks this out with something, and there's no Static Shock available, which is sort of the cleanest answer to 2 1-health units coming at you, then he is just going to die to Karma Get Excited unless he throws down a Kindly Tavern Keeper post-combat. But even then, I'm not in love with his position, since 4LW does still have that Rummage and that Deep Meditation.
Yeah, and I mean, it just comes back to that. The triple Will of Ionia, right? Because the Thermo Beam you mentioned, it's useful to have. It's certainly better than a lot of cards you have in this matchup, but at least if you Thermo Beam for 9 on a Swain or for 8 on a Leviathan, you're trading mana evenly, and the Swain deck is even trading on cards because they're drawing Swains with their Leviathans. When you hit Will of Ionia on an 8-cost Leviathan, it sets this deck back so far. And to do it 3 times in one matchup is certainly your trick to winning.
And I can't, as we had mentioned, you're sort of out of removal options for the Karma that aren't specifically 2 cards. So unless Kelvin throws down a Kindly Tavern Keeper in response to this, that is the only healing in the deck, then this is actually going to be for LW picking up the win in this extremely difficult matchup, beating out this lineup that was built to prey on him and will be advancing to the finals.
Wow, and the Swain comes out almost as an admission of defeat. I mean, it's a very nice animation. I love the character, but this time it is not the sort of exclamation of victory we normally see it to be. And this Karma Ezreal deck, it's the real deal.
Yeah, there's the double Get Excited lined up, and as we had mentioned, there's nothing that Kelvin can do about that. We see the GG Shen come out of 4LW, and Kelvin returning the favor is going to go down here, and that is your first finalist, everybody. Wow. I think, let me check Smash GG to see if there's actually another finalist already lined up for them, but...
I don't want to spoil it, but I will. It's Topher actually taking it out 2-1 over Croc AI. So you mentioned Croc AI, you're sort of the only player with winning pedigree in this... top 16, or one of the few players with winning pedigree in this top 16. Topher managing to overcome that and now putting himself into the final against 4LW. So at least it's the 2 players we've been following, and we get to see this War Mother's control deck. Can it take down the whole tournament?
Yeah, and that does mean that it is actually going to do it for us for the day. We're going to pass it over to Casanova and the Blevins to bring you guys the grand finals, kind of centralize the streams a little bit. He is actually currently sitting on a break screen for about the next minute, so we're kind of going to wrap things up here and then send you guys over there. Wandering Bard, thank you so much for coming out and joining me this weekend on the cast. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you. Is there anything that you kind of want to plug or shout out here at the end of the stream?
Yeah, certainly. First of all, I'd like to thank you, and also, thank RJam and thank all of the admin staff who made this tournament run incredibly smoothly over the weekend. It's a real pleasure. I've been waiting to get some casting done in Legends of Runeterra for a while, and hopefully this is not the last you'll see of me. And certainly I've enjoyed working with you all weekend. For people who do, want to see more of me or hear more of me, like I mentioned, hopefully doing more Legends of Runeterra stuff in the future, I think the best advice I can give is to go to Twitter and hit me up at AWanderingBard. I tend to collate everything I do there because otherwise it's on a ton of different channels. I'm sure you know the drill.
Yeah.
Boulevard, but I do tons of esports reporting on Dota 2. I'll be casting, in fact, later today my time, the Premier SEA and Australian League, and then also writing about fighting games and other esports over there. So check it out. But I'll see you whether you like it or not, I imagine.
Sounds about right. So it looks like they are just about to get their timer lined up, lining up perfectly with the raid. They didn't pull themselves off of the screen the second that the timer hit 0, and that is kind of what I lined it up for. So now I'm just over here looking a little bit goofy, but as soon as they pop that up, we'll kind of send you guys over. But yeah, check out all my socials. They're a little bit different. I have my link tree down somewhere. I think it's in the description of the Twitch, I would hope, but it's from the Boulevard on Twitter, from the BLVD, just because, like you said, we are constantly casting on different Twitch channels at different times for different things, and sometimes we don't know about it until a little bit later on. So definitely check me out on Twitter if you do like my casting and want to keep up with that and things of that nature. And yeah, shout out to Jam for running another phenomenal event and giving us the opportunity to cast this. I actually really enjoyed this format, to be honest.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and as you mentioned, doesn't necessarily reflect back on other formats, but I think all these players, especially those who just jump into every tournament with both feet, are going to take something away in terms of deck matchups, and maybe that fuels the next wave of innovation. So yeah, absolutely, grassroots card games kick ass forever.
Okay, so they actually reset the timer down to another 2 minutes, so we have to stall for another 2 minutes here. How you doing, man? How you?
I'm doing fine. I wasn't feeling so great earlier. The sleeping schedule for me this weekend has been kind of hellish. I have a lot of writing gigs that I'm trying to sort of wrap up over the weekend, and then RJam sort of offered me this chance to cast very late notice, and I obviously took it because if you want to get into a game like this, you have to kind of jump at the chances you're given, and wow, did it pay off. I've really enjoyed casting with you, Boulevard, and this has been a fantastic tournament. The caliber of play and deck building, I guess that's kind of kept me going. So,
yeah, so it looks like the raid actually timed out and automatically fired. So it looks like we do have everybody over to Casanova. That's going to do it for us, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and we're going to hop out.